Here are unexplained aviation stories of planes that never returned from the clouds. December 5th, 1945. 5 US Navy Avengers lift off from Fort Lauderdale for a routine exercise. Their leader soon reports compass failure. Voices crackle across radio channels, uncertain of the position, then silence. The Atlantic swallows 5 aircraft without a trace, yet the final garbled transmissions still echo with unease. The men who climbed into those TBM Avenger torpedo bombers were young, confident, and well-trained. They had flown countless hours over the Florida coastline and open water, rehearsing navigation exercises designed to prepare them for combat missions. That morning's mission, known as Navigation Problem Number 1, was considered simple. The pilots were to fly east, practice bombing runs over a designated target, then turn northwest and finally return to base. The sky was partly cloudy, the temperature was mild. Nothing about the conditions hinted at disaster. At 2:10 p.m, the formation lifted smoothly into the air. The roar of radial engines echoed across the field, fading as the squadron disappeared into the eastern sky. For the first hour, everything seemed routine. The Avengers flew steady, silver wings gleaming under scattered clouds. Ground controllers monitored their progress, occasionally receiving position checks. Then just after 3:30 p.m, the tone of the radio changed. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, called in with an unusual report. His compass was malfunctioning. Both his magnetic and gyro compasses seemed unreliable. "We don't know where we are," he admitted, his voice cutting in and out with static. He believed he might be over the Florida Keys, far to the south of where he should have been. His students, inexperienced pilots relying on his lead, followed as he attempted to reorient the group. Controllers urged Taylor to turn west, a heading that would eventually bring him back to land no matter where he truly was. But Taylor hesitated. He feared that a westward course would take the squadron deeper into the Atlantic, away from Florida. Confusion deepened as other pilots chimed in, their voices edged with concern. One insisted that turning west was the correct course, but protocol dictated they obey their commander. As the afternoon light faded, the situation grew dire. Radio operators across Florida logged fragments of the transmissions. "Everything looks strange," one pilot was heard saying. "Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." By late afternoon, Taylor sounded resigned. "We are heading 030 degrees for 45 minutes, then we will turn and fly north until we run out of fuel." At 5:50 p.m, radio contact was briefly re-established. The voices were tired, strained, but still disciplined. Then at 6:20 p.m, the last faint words reached the network. "All planes close up tight. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." Static overwhelmed the channel. After that, there was nothing. When the Avengers failed to return, the Navy launched one of the largest air and sea searches in its history. Hundreds of aircraft and ships combed the waters off Florida, stretching into the Bahamas. For 5 days they searched, scouring thousands of square miles, but not a single piece of wreckage from the Avengers was ever confirmed. Even more haunting, a PBM Mariner sent to assist the search exploded in mid-air that same night, killing all 13 aboard. Witnesses at sea reported a sudden fireball, and the coincidence deepened the sense of mystery. Official investigations concluded that Flight 19 likely ran out of fuel and ditched in the Atlantic. Powerful currents and deep waters would have quickly swallowed the wrecks, but alternative theories linger. Some point to Taylor's confusion, suggesting navigational error combined with poor weather sealed their fate. Others lean toward folklore, citing the Bermuda Triangle as explanation. Yet beneath the speculation lies a simple truth. 5 planes and 14 young men vanished within earshot of the Florida coast, leaving behind only faint static and fragments of log entries. The Atlantic gave no answers, and just when investigators thought the file was closed, one last detail unsettled them further. Dozens of search aircraft reported unusually poor compass readings in the same area on that same day. The sky had fallen silent, but its instruments whispered something stranger still. On August 2nd, 1947, a British airliner named Stardust vanished into the Andes. The last message carried a single word, Stendek. For 50 years, the mountain kept its secret. When ice finally released twisted metal, investigators found answers only half complete, and the strange code unsolved. The flight that day was a British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian, a sleek 4-engine airliner adapted from the wartime Lancaster bomber. Its name, Stardust, was painted in elegant script along the fuselage. On board were 11 souls, 6 crew members and 5 passengers. The journey from Buenos Aires to Santiago was routine, a path flown countless times across the spine of South America. At 1:46 p.m, the aircraft lifted smoothly from the Argentine capital. The weather was mixed, cloud banks gathered above the Andes, but visibility along the route was judged acceptable. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reginald Cook, an experienced Royal Air Force veteran, guided the climb toward the high passes. Navigators charted their progress carefully, mindful that mountain weather could shift in minutes. For hours, radio communications remained steady. Position reports were transmitted on schedule, each confirming progress westward across Argentina. Then, as the flight neared Santiago, a final coded message was sent to the control tower. It read, ETA Santiago, 1745 Stendek. The tower, puzzled, requested clarification. Twice more the word was repeated, Stendek. Then the frequency fell silent. No further signal was ever heard. When Stardust failed to arrive, Chilean and Argentine authorities launched searches across the Andes. Aircraft combed ridges, valleys and glaciers. Ground parties set out on foot, braving thin air and treacherous slopes. But there was nothing, no smoke, no wreckage, no trace of the 11 on board. The mountains had simply swallowed them. For decades the mystery lingered. Families demanded answers. Theories multiplied. Some suggested a crash in hidden valleys. Others speculated about sabotage or even secret cargo linked to post-war intrigue. But without physical evidence, every suggestion remained shadow and speculation. The strangest puzzle was the word Stendek. Radio operators swore it was transmitted clearly. Analysts proposed explanations, perhaps an acronym for Standard En Route Descent Clearance. Others believed it a simple transmission garbled by turbulence, a slurred descent reversed in Morse code. But none of these explanations satisfied all experts. The word lingered, stark in logbooks, as enigmatic as when it was first tapped out across the airwaves. It was not until 1998, 51 years later, that the mountains relented. Climbers ascending Mount Tupungato stumbled upon twisted fragments of metal protruding from the ice. A Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, still intact, lay embedded in the glacier. Fabric and human remains soon followed. Search teams confirmed what many had suspected. Stardust had struck the mountain head-on, likely hidden by clouds and turbulence. The impact triggered an avalanche, burying the aircraft deep beneath layers of snow that slowly became ice. Forensic analysis revealed details long hidden. The engines showed no signs of failure. The fuselage carried the scars of high-speed impact, consistent with controlled flight into terrain. Investigators concluded the crew had misjudged their position, believing they had already crossed the mountains and begun descent towards Santiago. Instead, they were still above high ridges shrouded in cloud. At more than 500 kilometers per hour, Stardust slammed into ice, erasing itself in an instant. And yet, even with discovery, the enigma persisted. Why had the crew repeated the word Stendek 3 times? Why had no other flight ever used the same code? Theories continue, but no single explanation closes the file. Today, remnants of the aircraft remain locked in the glacier, released in fragments as the ice shifts each summer. Each year, new relics surface: uniform cloth, riveted panels, a navigator's log. The mountain, piece by piece, tells the story, but the final word, sent calmly, deliberately, and without further explanation, remains unbroken. Stendek, a message from a vanished aircraft, still suspended between clarity and silence. And investigators remind us, the glacier has not yet given up everything. A DC-4 carrying 58 people disappeared over Lake Michigan on June 24, 1950. The pilot's last call begged for a lower altitude through violent storms. The request was denied. Minutes later, the aircraft was gone, leaving only fragments of upholstery drifting on the waves. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was scheduled from New York City to Minneapolis, a route familiar to both crew and company. On board that summer night were 55 passengers and 3 crew members. At the controls was Captain Robert Lind, a veteran aviator with thousands of hours logged, steady in his reputation and calm under pressure. The Douglas DC-4 he flew was a 4-engine workhorse of the post-war skies, widely trusted for its reliability. The evening departure was routine. At 8:31 p.m, Flight 2501 lifted off from LaGuardia, its engines droning steadily into the twilight. As the hours passed, the airliner cut across Ohio and into the Midwest, radioing position reports on schedule. But as the DC-4 approached the broad expanse of Lake Michigan, conditions began to change. Storms had been building over the region that night. Summer thunderheads rising high into the dark, their anvil tops brushing 20,000 feet. Lightning flared intermittently, illuminating the lake surface below like brief jagged lanterns. Pilots in other aircraft reported severe turbulence, strong winds, and heavy rain. Controllers monitored the situation carefully, juggling altitude requests from multiple flights seeking smoother air. At 11:13 p.m, Captain Lynn's voice came through the radio, steady but edged with strain. He requested permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet, hoping to escape the violent buffeting. The controller, aware of traffic and storm intensity at lower levels, denied the request. The DC-4 maintained course into the worsening weather. Just minutes later, a final call was logged. Lind repeated his request, adding that the aircraft was encountering severe turbulence, then static. The transmission ended abruptly. No distress call followed, no position update arrived. Radar in 1950 was limited, unable to track aircraft continuously, leaving only radio reports to place the DC-4. And then there were none. When the aircraft failed to appear over Milwaukee on schedule, alarms were raised. Search planes launched at dawn, crisscrossing the lake's surface. Ships and Coast Guard cutters spread out, scanning for oil slicks or wreckage. Within hours, debris was found, a scatter of seat cushions, armrests, and fragments of upholstery drifting near Benton Harbor, Michigan. But no fuselage, no bodies, nothing more substantial than floating scraps. The search intensified over the following days. Hundreds of square miles were dragged by sonar and divers. Yet Lake Michigan yielded nothing further. Unlike ocean disappearances, this one was tantalizingly close to land in relatively shallow water. Investigators expected wreckage to be found quickly. Its absence only deepened the mystery. The Civil Aeronautics Board reviewed weather reports, crew experience, and aircraft condition. Their conclusion, released months later, was unsatisfying, probable cause unknown. The violent storms could have induced a structural failure, or turbulence may have forced the DC-4 into an uncontrollable descent. But without wreckage, no definitive answer could be drawn. For decades, the disappearance of Flight 2501 remained Lake Michigan's most haunting mystery. Families grieved without graves. Local fishermen spoke of sonar pings striking something large beneath the silt. In the 2000s, renewed efforts using modern underwater mapping traced the lake bed. Small fragments were recovered, metal sheets, wiring, human remains, suggesting the aircraft did rest there still, shattered and spread wide by impact. Yet the main fuselage has never been located. The vast inland sea, ringed by cities and crossed daily by ships and aircraft, keeps its secret. In its depths, Flight 2501 lies somewhere beyond reach, a reminder that even the familiar Midwest can hide mysteries as deep as any ocean. And when divers resurface, bringing fragments of aluminum and cloth from the cold mud below, one question always remains: why did the aircraft descend so suddenly into silence? The answer, like the rest of Flight 2501, is still waiting beneath the waves. In the early hours of December 28, 1948, the DC-3 sent routine position reports as it neared Miami. The weather was calm, the crew calm, but radar never confirmed their arrival. Not a single trace of the aircraft or its passengers was ever recovered. The Douglas DC-3, tail number NC16002, was no stranger to Caribbean routes. This aircraft, operated by Airborne Transport, had flown thousands of miles over open seas and island chains. That night, Captain Robert F. Lindquist and First Officer Robert H. Bob Lumsden prepared for a scheduled flight from San Juan, Puerto Rico to Miami, Florida. On board were 29 passengers, many of them travelling home after the holiday season. The weather across the region was reported as clear, visibility good, winds moderate, with only light clouds scattered across the horizon. Before takeoff, Captain Lindquist filed a maintenance note. The aircraft had shown electrical irregularities. Its landing gear warning light had malfunctioned, and one of the batteries appeared weak. Mechanics inspected the DC-3 but judged it airworthy. Still, the captain remained cautious, acknowledging in radio traffic that the batteries might not fully support long-range communication. At 10:03 p.m, the DC-3 departed San Juan. For hours, its progress seemed uneventful. The crew filed routine position reports, each one confirming they were on schedule. Their voices were calm, their headings precise. As the aircraft crossed the Caribbean toward Florida, nothing suggested trouble. Then, just after 4 a.m, something strange occurred. A final radio call from NC-16002 reported its position as approximately 50 miles south of Miami. The words were clear, the tone unhurried, but the transmission was not heard in Miami. It was picked up in New Orleans, far out of range for such a signal under normal conditions. Air traffic controllers in Miami, expecting to see the aircraft appear on radar, never did. The DC-3 was gone. When the flight failed to land, search operations began immediately. Aircraft from Miami and Coast Guard cutters scoured the Florida Straits. The waters south of Miami were calm, the skies clear. If the DC-3 had ditched, searchers expected to find oil slicks, floating debris, or survivors in rafts. Yet hour after hour, the sea remained empty. Investigators pieced together what little information they had. Electrical failure was considered possible. With weak batteries, the crew may have struggled to transmit accurately. Their signals distorted and misdirected. Navigation error was another theory. If the DC-3 had strayed off course, its final approach may have carried it over deeper waters, leaving little chance for recovery. The Civil Aeronautics Board, reviewing testimony and logs, could not assign a definitive cause. Their final report listed the accident as unknown. No wreckage, no bodies, no cargo were ever recovered. The sea had erased the flight completely. For decades, NC-16002 became a symbol of the Bermuda Triangle legend, cited as one of many vanishings in the region. Enthusiasts pointed to the unusual radio reception in New Orleans as evidence of electromagnetic anomalies, claiming atmospheric conditions bent the signal in ways unexplained. Skeptics noted that skip propagation, a known radio phenomenon, could account for it. But the fact remained. The flight's last known words placed it minutes from landing, and yet nothing, no trace at all, was ever found. Even today, the loss of NC-16002 stands apart. Unlike other disappearances in turbulent storms or high mountain passes, this one occurred on a clear night, within sight of its destination. Families waited in Miami that morning, watching for the aircraft that never appeared. Their wait became permanent. And each December, when the anniversary passes, the Florida coast remembers a DC-3 that approached the lights of Miami but never touched its runway. What happened in those final minutes remains written only in static, carried once through the dark and then lost to silence. January 30th, 1948. Flying low across the Atlantic, the Avro Tudor, called Star Tiger, fought fierce headwinds. The crew checked in routinely until they did not. No call of distress, no debris field, only empty seas waiting under cold stars. British South American Airways had placed high hopes in its fleet of Avro Tudor aircraft. The Tudor 4, with its long fuselage and 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, was designed to cross oceans, carrying passengers in comfort. The Star Tiger was one of these aircraft scheduled to fly tuned from the Azores to Bermuda that winter night. On board were 25 people, 6 crew and 19 passengers, including Sir Arthur Coningham, commander of the Royal Air Force in the Mediterranean during World War II. The aircraft departed from Santa Maria in the Azores at 3:34 p.m. local time. Weather forecasts predicted strong headwinds, gusting as high as 50 knots, and occasional showers. Captain Brian W. McMillan, experienced but known for a cautious style, made an unusual decision. He would fly at a very low altitude, around 2,000 feet. At that height, he hoped to avoid the most severe turbulence and icing, but the trade-off was significant. Flying low meant higher fuel consumption, and the Tudor 4 had little margin to spare. For the first hours, radio transmissions remained routine. At 9:30 p.m, the navigator reported an estimated position, still en route. The crew sounded calm, though they were several hours behind schedule due to the unrelenting headwinds. At 3:15 a.m, Star Tiger made its last routine communication. The message reported the aircraft's position as roughly 340 miles east-southeast of Bermuda. The estimate was precise, the tone professional. The next call should have been its approach to Bermuda around 5 a.m. But no further word was ever heard. Controllers in Bermuda listened through the early morning hours. Static hissed on the frequency, but no voices came. As dawn broke, the island's airfields prepared for an aircraft that never arrived. By mid-morning, search operations were underway. US Navy and Air Force aircraft joined the Royal Air Force in combing thousands of square miles of Atlantic water. Surface vessels fanned out across likely drift zones, scanning for oil slicks or wreckage. The searches continued for several days, but nothing was found. Not a life raft, not a seat cushion, not a single piece of debris. The ocean surface was empty, as though the Tudor had dissolved into the wind itself. Investigators convened soon after. The loss of 25 lives, including a decorated war commander, demanded answers, yet without wreckage, their conclusions could only be tentative. The official report pointed to the decision to fly unusually low. At 2,000 feet, the aircraft faced higher fuel burn, less margin for navigation, and exposure to unpredictable turbulence. A sudden downdraft or unexpected mechanical failure could have left no time for a distress call. The report listed the cause as unknown. Still, questions lingered. Why did no radio call of distress emerge even in the final minutes? Did the headwinds exhaust the aircraft's fuel earlier estimated? Was the Tudor's compass equipment, already criticised in earlier flights, to blame for a navigation error? Each theory carried weight, but none resolved the silence. For Bermuda, the disappearance of Star Tiger marked the beginning of a troubling pattern. A year later, its sister aircraft Star Ariel would vanish under similarly mysterious circumstances, deepening the sense of an Atlantic corridor that swallowed planes whole. In the decades since, no confirmed wreckage of Star Tiger has ever been recovered. The North Atlantic, cold and restless, continues to guard its secret. And every time historians revisit the file, one detail stands out. The final radio call carried no urgency at all, only routine calm. Then, in a moment, the night sky held nothing but wind. 1 year later, January 17th, 1949. The Star Ariel departed Bermuda bound for Jamaica beneath clear skies. The last radio call carried no urgency. Minutes later, silence. The Caribbean search found not one floating trace, an absence stranger than any storm. The aircraft was another Avro Tudor 4, the sister ship of the Star Tiger lost the year before. British South American Airways operated the flight, carrying 13 passengers and 7 crew members. Captain John McPhee, a veteran of wartime flying, was at the controls. Weather across the route was excellent. Clear visibility, calm winds, and no sign of the winter storms that had plagued Star Tiger. The conditions seemed ideal for a routine flight of less than 4 hours. At 8:41 a.m, the Star Ariel lifted off from Bermuda's Kindley Field. Witnesses on the ground watched the silver aircraft climb smoothly into blue skies before banking southwest toward Jamaica. Inside the cockpit, the crew radioed in to report their planned altitude of 18,000 feet. Their voices carried no hint of difficulty. At 9:42 a.m, a position report was transmitted. The crew stated they were approximately 150 miles south of Bermuda, flying steadily. They noted that they were maintaining their altitude and expected to check in again as they neared Jamaica. This was standard procedure. Then, without any warning, the frequency went quiet. No mayday call, no further report. The Star Ariel never arrived. When the aircraft failed to land in Kingston, urgent searches began. The calm weather aided rescue operations. British, American, and Caribbean aircraft swept the likely route, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Ships patrolled the sea lanes, eyes scanning the horizon for smoke, oil, or wreckage. Days passed. Nothing was found. The disappearance was unnerving not only for its suddenness but also for the total lack of evidence. A ditching at sea, even in deep water, would normally scatter debris, seat cushions, luggage, or rafts. The Caribbean's clear skies and calm seas should have made floating wreckage visible, yet the surface remained unbroken. Investigators faced an uncomfortable pattern. 2 Avro Tudor 4 aircraft from the same airline had vanished over the Atlantic in consecutive years. Both disappearances occurred without distress calls. Both searches found nothing. Confidence in the Tudor design began to waver, with some critics suggesting the aircraft was prone to technical failure at high altitude. Others noted weaknesses in its long-range navigation systems, but the official inquiry into Star Ariel reached no definite conclusion. The report cited the absence of wreckage, the clear weather, and the lack of any distress signal as baffling. Mechanical failure could not be ruled out, but without evidence it remained speculation. Over time, alternative theories grew. Some suggested a sudden depressurization at altitude, incapacitating the crew before a call could be made. Others pointed to the possibility of fuel mismanagement or structural fatigue. Yet none of these theories explained why no trace had been left on the calm sea below. The mystery deepened when radio operators across the Caribbean reported unusual static on January 17th. Communications between multiple flights that day had been sporadic, with messages fading in and out. Was the Star Aerial's final transmission simply lost to atmospheric interference? Or was the silence caused by something more final? Families of the passengers waited in Kingston, scanning the horizon as hours stretched into days. Their wait became permanent. The Star Aerial was declared lost with all hands. Together with the Star Tiger, its loss fed into the emerging legend of a region where planes could vanish without a trace. The Bermuda Triangle story would later grow large in popular culture, and these two Tudors, similar in design, lost under different skies, became central to its narrative. And yet stripped of myth, the facts remain stark. A clear sky, an experienced crew, and a well-maintained aircraft. Then silence. No storm to blame, no wreckage to examine, no final words to decode. The Caribbean holds its secrets well, and somewhere beneath its calm surface, perhaps, the Tudor lies still. March 16, 1962. A US military charter left Guam carrying 93 souls. The night sky was clear, the engine steady. Somewhere over the Pacific, the aircraft vanished without sending distress. Witnesses later spoke of a sudden flash of light far above the waves. The aircraft was a Lockheed Super Constellation, one of the most advanced long-range transports of its era. Operated by Flying Tiger Line, it had been contracted by the US Department of Defense to carry Army personnel to Vietnam during the early years of American involvement in Southeast Asia. On board were 11 crew and 96 passengers, most of them young soldiers bound for duty in a conflict that was only beginning to escalate. Flight 739 departed Travis Air Force Base in California days earlier, making several planned stops across the Pacific. By the time it reached Guam on March 15th, it had already covered thousands of miles. Maintenance checks were performed, fuel tanks refilled, and flight plans carefully reviewed. Weather across the next leg from Guam to the Philippines was reported as excellent. At 12:57 a.m. local time on March 16th, the Super Constellation lifted off from Guam's runway, its 4 Wright R-3350 engines droning in synchrony. Witnesses described a clean, uneventful departure into the darkness of the Western Pacific. For nearly 2 hours, everything appeared routine. The crew transmitted position reports on schedule, confirming steady progress along their route. Then silence. The next expected report never came. When the aircraft failed to appear on radar or make contact with Manila, air traffic controllers raised the alarm. Search operations began almost immediately. The US military, along with Allied forces in the region, launched one of the largest coordinated searches in Pacific history. Over the next several days, 1,300 people, 48 aircraft, and 8 surface ships scoured more than 200,000 square miles of ocean. Not a single piece of wreckage was found. Yet there was one chilling lead. The crew of an oil tanker, the SSTL Lenson, reported witnessing a brilliant flash of light in the sky around the time and place the aircraft would have been flying. They described it as a sudden explosion high above the waves, lasting only moments before fading into darkness. The report was logged and passed to investigators, but with no debris to examine, no confirmation was possible. The Civil Aeronautics Board convened to analyse the disappearance. Their findings were sparse. The last known position placed the constellation over open ocean in clear weather. No distress calls had been received, suggesting that whatever happened was sudden and catastrophic. Mechanical failure, structural breakup, or even an onboard explosion were all considered, but the absence of physical evidence left the cause officially recorded as unknown. For the families of the 93 passengers and crew, the lack of answers was devastating. With no wreckage recovered, no bodies returned, closure was impossible. In 2019, nearly 6 decades later, the names of the lost were finally added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., recognizing that although they never reached their destination, their journey had been part of the conflict's earliest mobilizations. Speculation has endured in the years since. Some point to the tanker's testimony as the strongest clue, suggesting a mid-air explosion, whether mechanical or deliberate. Others argue that structural fatigue in the constellation could have caused an in-flight breakup, a rare but documented risk for the type. Still others believe the truth lies beneath the Pacific, scattered across seabeds too deep to be surveyed with the technology of the time. The skies that night were clear, the engine steady, and the route familiar. Yet in a moment, the aircraft ceased to exist in the record. No signal, no trace. And though searchers gave everything to the effort, the Pacific returned only silence. The only memory left is a brief flash of light, seen from the deck of a distant ship, and then the endless dark beyond. June 1st, 2009, an Airbus. A 330 crossed the equator into towering storm clouds. Automated systems disengaged. The cockpit filled with alarms. Then the aircraft slipped into darkness. It would take 2 years before search teams recovered the black boxes from miles beneath the Atlantic. Air France Flight 447 was a scheduled overnight service from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. On board were 228 people, including 12 crew and 216 passengers from more than 30 nations. The aircraft, an Airbus A330-200, was considered one of the most reliable airliners of its class. Departing Brazil at 7:29 p.m. local time, the flight climbed steadily toward cruising altitude, setting course northeast across the Atlantic. As midnight approached, the aircraft neared the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a band of intense storms straddling the equator. Weather satellites showed towering cumulonimbus clouds rising to 50,000 feet. Crews traversing the region that night reported turbulence and heavy precipitation. The cockpit crew of AF-447, Captain Marc Dubois and 2 relief first officers, David Robert and Pierre-Cédric Bonin, prepared for the challenging crossing. At 11:10 p.m, the aircraft transmitted its last routine position report. Everything appeared normal. Yet within the next 20 minutes, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The A330 encountered a zone of supercooled water droplets that froze on contact with its pitot tubes, the small sensors that measure airspeed. As the sensors iced over, airspeed readings to the flight computers became inconsistent. At 2:10 a.m. Universal Coordinated Time, the autopilot disconnected. A chime sounded in the cockpit, and warnings lit across the instrument panel. Suddenly the flight was manual, in turbulent night skies, with unreliable airspeed indicators. The youngest of the 3 pilots, Bonin, had control of the aircraft. In the confusion, he pulled back on the side stick, raising the nose. The jet began to climb. For the next 4 minutes, a cascade of alarms filled the cockpit. The stall warnings sounded repeatedly. Altitude fluctuated. The pilots struggled to interpret conflicting data. Altitude, attitude, and speed instruments showing contradictory readings. In the darkness, without an external horizon, spatial disorientation compounded the crisis. Instead of leveling off, the A330 entered a high-altitude stall. Its nose remained pitched upward, engines producing thrust, but the wings no longer generated lift. At 2:14 a.m, the final automated transmission was sent. The aircraft had descended below radar coverage. Seconds later, AF-447 struck the Atlantic at high speed. The impact destroyed the aircraft instantly. No distress call had ever been transmitted. In the days following, ships and aircraft from multiple nations searched the equatorial Atlantic. Bodies and floating debris were recovered, but the fuselage had sunk to depths of nearly 4,000 meters, well beyond conventional salvage capabilities. For 2 years, the black boxes remained lost, hidden on the seabed. Families grieved without answers. Finally, in May 2011, deep-sea submersibles located the wreckage. Remarkably, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered intact. The French Accident Investigation Bureau, BEA, spent months analysing the data. Their final report, released in 2012, concluded that the accident was triggered by pitot tube icing, compounded by inappropriate pilot responses and inadequate training for high-altitude stall recovery. Yet even with technical explanation, the tragedy of AF-447 retains its aura of mystery. How could a modern jet equipped with advanced avionics and flown by trained pilots descend helplessly into the sea in less than 5 minutes? The cockpit recordings revealed calm professionalism punctuated by moments of confusion, but no clear recognition of the stall until it was too late. The story of AF-447 is often told as a lesson in human factors, how technology can overwhelm when it fails, and how ambiguity in critical seconds can unravel even the most routine flight. And still, one haunting truth remains. When the final alarm faded and the night went quiet again, the aircraft was gone, leaving only silence above the equator and 2 years of waiting before the ocean gave back its evidence. On March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 with 239 people left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. 40 minutes later, its transponder went dark. Satellite handshakes suggested an unthinkable detour into the Indian Ocean. To this day, only scattered fragments have washed ashore. Flight MH370 was scheduled as an overnight journey, departing just after midnight. On board were passengers from 15 nations, including 152 Chinese citizens, 38 Malaysians, and individuals from Europe, North America, and Australia. The crew, led by Captain Zaharieh Ahmad Shah, were veterans of Malaysia Airlines' long-haul service. The Boeing 777-200ER itself was considered one of the safest and most reliable aircraft in service, with millions of flight hours logged worldwide. At 12:41 a.m. local time, MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The climb and initial cruise were uneventful. The flight settled into its assigned altitude of 35,000 feet, heading northeast across the South China Sea. At 1:19 a.m, the co-pilot signed off from Malaysian Air Traffic Control with the words, "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was the last confirmed communication from the cockpit. 2 minutes later, the aircraft thrust belt and transponder stopped transmitting. On civilian radar, MH370 disappeared. Yet military radar later showed a troubling path. The aircraft turned west, back across the Malay Peninsula, then south into the vastness of the Indian Ocean. No distress call was made. When MH370 failed to check in with Vietnamese controllers, alarms were raised. Within hours, search and rescue operations began over the South China Sea. But as radar data and satellite analysis emerged, the focus shifted. Inmarsat satellites had continued to receive hourly handshakes from the aircraft, simple automated signals confirming its systems were alive. By modelling these signals, investigators traced a possible arc across the southern Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the original flight path. For families waiting in Beijing, the news was devastating. Instead of approaching China, their loved one's aircraft had veered in the opposite direction, into one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth. Search efforts mobilised quickly. Dozens of ships and aircraft scoured the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, and later, the Indian Ocean. Despite the largest and most expensive search in aviation history, no floating wreckage was found in the first weeks. The sea remained empty, except for rumours and false leads. Then in July 2015, a breakthrough. A barnacle-encrusted flaperon washed ashore on Réunion Island, east of Madagascar. Later, other fragments surfaced along the coasts of Mozambique, Tanzania, and South Africa. Each was conclusively linked to MH370. These finds confirmed what satellite data had suggested. The aircraft had ended its flight in the southern Indian Ocean. But the main fuselage, flight recorders, and the bulk of its passengers have never been recovered. Two major searches, led first by Australia and later by private contractors, mapped vast stretches of ocean floor, covering more than 120,000 square kilometres. The seabed revealed ancient volcanoes, deep trenches, and unexpected geological formations, but not the wreckage of MH370. Theories about the disappearance multiplied. Some argue mechanical failure, perhaps a sudden decompression or electrical fire, incapacitated the crew. Others suggest deliberate human action, either by the captain, a crew member, or an intruder. The official Malaysian report in 2018 could not assign blame, citing unprecedented loss of contact and inconclusive evidence. For the families, uncertainty endures. Every piece of floating debris confirmed their loss, but without the full wreckage, the story remains incomplete. The silence of the final hours, the absence of a distress call, and the inexplicable deviation from course all remain unanswered. In 2025, talk of renewed searches continues. Advances in undersea mapping and robotics may someday reveal what lies on the seabed west of Australia. Until then, MH370 is a reminder of how, even in an era of satellites and digital tracking, an airliner can vanish almost without trace. And somewhere in the cold expanse of the Southern Ocean, the story of its final hours is still waiting in the dark. In 1968, an Indian Air Force Antonov An-12 vanished over the Himalayas. For decades, nothing surfaced. Then in 2003, melting ice revealed twisted aluminum and faded uniforms. The mountains had held the secret for 35 years before giving it back piece by piece. The Antonov An-12 was a rugged Soviet-built turboprop designed for heavy cargo and military transport. On February 7, 1968, one such aircraft lifted off from Chandigarh in northern India. Its destination was Leh, a high-altitude airfield perched at over 10,600 feet in Ladakh, nestled among some of the world's highest peaks. The flight carried 102 people, crew members, Air Force personnel, and passengers bound for the remote Himalayan base. The route was one of the most challenging in aviation. Aircraft had to cross towering ridges where the weather shifted without warning. Even in clear skies, powerful winds swept across glaciers, funneling through valleys with unpredictable force. Pilots navigating these routes relied on precision and experience, balancing engine performance against the thin air of high altitudes. At first, the An-12's progress seemed normal. Radio communications with air traffic control confirmed its position shortly after departure. The aircraft began climbing toward the mountains, aiming for passes that would lead it to Leh. Then suddenly, contact was lost. Radar coverage in the Himalayas was limited, and no distress call was ever received. One moment the aircraft was accounted for, and the next it was gone. Search operations began immediately. Teams of soldiers and mountaineers set out across ice fields and snow-choked valleys, scouring routes where the An-12 might have gone down. For weeks they searched, but the weather was brutal. Blizzards, avalanches, and shifting stuff raised any sign of wreckage. The aircraft seemed to have disappeared entirely into the Himalayan silence. Over time, the An-12's disappearance faded into memory. Families mourned without closure, and the mountains gave no answers. For 35 years, the case remained unsolved. Then, in the summer of 2003, everything changed. Glaciers in the Himalayas had begun to retreat. As ice melted and shifted, climbers stumbled upon a startling sight. Fragments of aluminum glinting in the sun, half buried in ice. A rusted engine, torn fuselage panels, and scattered human remains were found at nearly 16,000 feet on the Dhaka Glacier. Among the wreckage were pieces of faded military uniforms, boots, and personal effects. The discovery confirmed what had long been suspected. The An-12 had crashed into a remote glacier after striking a ridge. The impact had shattered the aircraft and triggered an avalanche, burying the wreckage deep under snow and ice. For decades, the glacier preserved it, only revealing its secret as climate change thinned its icy covering. In subsequent years, recovery teams returned to the site, each time retrieving more remains and wreckage. Indian Army expeditions in 2009, 2012, and 2018 brought back personal items, watches, identity cards, and helmets that once belonged to the men aboard. Families finally received confirmation, though not the full story of what happened in the flight's final moments. The official explanation suggests the aircraft may have encountered sudden bad weather, disorientation, or a downdraft that pushed it into the mountainside. The thin air at high altitude left little margin for recovery, yet without the cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorder, neither installed on the An-12 of that era, the precise chain of events will never be known. What remains is a haunting image, fragments of a long-lost aircraft re-emerging slowly from the ice year by year, as if the mountains were reluctant to give up their secret. And even today, climbers on the Dhaka Glacier speak of glints of metal appearing after each summer thaw. The An-12 is still there, slowly returning itself to the world, one piece at a time. On June 24, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 191 reported electrical smoke in the cabin. The crew fought to return, but eyewitnesses spoke of strange lights before the jet struck the ground. Investigators found wiring faults, but whispers of something stranger lingered. The aircraft that day was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, operating a domestic service across the United States. Eastern Airlines had long trusted the type for short to medium haul flights. On board were 67 passengers and 5 crew led by Captain Roy Key, an experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours. The DC-9 departed from Boston in the evening, bound for Miami, with an intermediate stop in Newark. Weather was stable, skies relatively clear, and the takeoff was uneventful. But not long after departure, trouble began. At 8:05 p.m, passengers reported smelling smoke. Crew members entered the cabin, and confirmed haze forming along the ceiling. The cockpit soon reported electrical difficulties to controllers. Alarms flickered intermittently across the instrument panel. Power to some systems appeared unstable, with circuits tripping and resetting. As the smoke thickened, the pilots made the decision to divert. They turned back toward Boston, seeking the nearest suitable runway. Air traffic control cleared them for an emergency landing, but the aircraft's problems were escalating. Lighting in the cabin failed, leaving passengers in near darkness except for the glow of occasional sparks behind the panels. The intercom cut in and out. The crew struggled to keep situational awareness while troubleshooting the source of the fire. Eyewitnesses on the ground later described strange visuals in the sky that night. Several motorists along the route reported seeing a bright, pulsing glow near the descending aircraft. Some described it as a ball of light following the jet. Others thought it was reflections from flames. In the confusion of smoke and night, the distinction blurred. At 8:33 p.m, Flight 191 was cleared to land, but just minutes later, communication with the DC-9 was lost. Witnesses near Logan Airport reported the aircraft descending too low, trailing sparks, before it disappeared behind treetops. Moments later, a fireball lit the horizon as the DC-9 struck the ground in a wooded area near Windsor, Connecticut. Rescue teams reached the site quickly, but the wreckage was already engulfed in flames. Of the 72 people on board, only 9 survived. Most succumbed to smoke inhalation before the crash. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation. Wreckage analysis revealed severe damage to wiring bundles in the forward cabin, particularly those controlling lighting and environmental systems. Traces of arcing and charring suggested an electrical fire had spread quickly through insulation. Investigators concluded that a short circuit behind a lavatory panel likely ignited nearby materials. The official report listed undetermined electrical fault as the probable cause. Safety recommendations were issued to improve fire detection and insulation materials in DC-9 aircraft worldwide. Yet the mystery did not end there. The eyewitness accounts of unusual lights persisted. Some investigators attributed them to reflections of burning insulation vented through fuselage panels. Others dismissed them as misperceptions during a chaotic night. But among locals, stories grew of strange energy around the flight path, of electrical phenomena no report could fully explain. In later years, Flight 191 became part of aviation lore, often confused with other accidents sharing the same flight number. The most infamous was American Airlines Flight 191, which crashed in Chicago in 1979. But this earlier disaster carried its own unsettling legacy. An event where smoke, fire, and unexplained lights blurred the boundary between mechanical failure and mystery. Today, memorials remember those lost on June 24, 1972. Officially, the cause is recorded as an electrical fire. Unofficially, whispers remain about what witnesses saw in the night sky, brief, bright, and gone as quickly as the jet itself. And so, Flight 191 rests as another reminder. Sometimes the answers lie in charred wiring, and sometimes in the silence of things never fully explained. In 1969, a C-119 flying boxcar left Homestead Air Force Base in Florida on a night training run. Minutes into the flight, radar plots showed it break formation, then fade. Despite clear weather, neither wreckage nor remains were ever found. The Fairchild C-119 was a distinctive twin-boom transport, nicknamed the Flying Boxcar for its large rectangular cargo hold. It had been a workhorse for the US Air Force throughout the 1950s and 60s, hauling troops, supplies, and vehicles across continents. By 1969, the type was a familiar sight at American bases worldwide, especially in training flights over Florida's coast. On the night of the disappearance, a C-119 took off from Homestead Air Force Base as part of a multiplane formation exercise. Weather reports recorded clear skies, steady visibility, and calm winds over southern Florida. These were near perfect conditions for a routine mission. The aircraft carried a standard crew complement, men well accustomed to the type's quirks and its heavy, deliberate handling. As the formation climbed out from Homestead, ground radar tracked each aircraft steadily. Then, within minutes, something unexpected happened. Controllers noticed one radar return separate from the group. The C-119 appeared to veer slightly off course as though diverging from the planned heading. Operators expected a correction, but instead the blip began to weaken. Seconds later it vanished entirely. Radio calls were made, but no response came back from the missing aircraft. The other C-19s in the exercise maintained their positions, reporting no unusual turbulence, no weather anomalies, and no visual signs of an emergency. From their cockpits, the missing aircraft simply slipped away into the night sky. Within minutes, search and rescue protocols were activated. Aircraft from Homestead and nearby bases fanned out across the Florida Straits. The expectation was straightforward. If the C-119 had suffered a mechanical failure or engine fire, there should be wreckage on the water, an oil slick, floating debris, or life rafts. But hour after hour passed with no sign. Surface vessels scoured the likely area, but the seas were calm and empty. No beacon signals were ever received from emergency transmitters. The absence of any distress call puzzled investigators most. Even in a sudden engine failure, the C-119 had enough glide capability for the crew to radio their position. That silence suggested something catastrophic, or something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, the Air Force convened a board of inquiry. Investigators examined maintenance logs, crew records, and weather data. No technical red flags stood out. The C-119 had been serviced recently, with no history of recurring issues. The crew were experienced, fit for duty, and cleared by medical officers. With no physical wreckage to study, the inquiry could reach no firm conclusion. The report's language was terse. Aircraft missing, cause undetermined. The case might have faded into obscurity, but its details echoed other vanishings in the region. The Florida Straits, stretching into the Bermuda Triangle, already carried a reputation for unexplained losses. The boxcar's disappearance under clear skies without storm, without warning, fed into the larger narrative of that region's mysteries. For the families of the crew, the lack of answers meant no closure. Without wreckage, no remains could be returned for burial. Memorials were held, but grief stretched on, unanswered. Decades later, occasional expeditions have revisited the Florida coast with sonar and underwater survey equipment. The shallow waters hold countless wrecks from centuries of maritime history, but none have been conclusively linked to the missing boxcar. What is remembered is the suddenness of it. One moment, the radar showed the C-119 flying in formation. The next, its signal faltered and was gone. And to this day, the flying boxcar's disappearance is marked not by debris or testimony, but by silence. An aircraft erased from clear skies, leaving behind only a question that has never been answered. A Pan American DC-4 departed Lima, Peru, with cargo and passengers. Hours later, its position report ended mid-sentence. Searchers combed jungle and shoreline, but the airliner seemed to dissolve into cloud. No sign ever surfaced. The Douglas DC-4 was a reliable four-engine transport that had carried passengers safely across continents since the Second World War. Pan American Airways, one of the most trusted international carriers of its time, operated the type across South America, connecting remote capitals with hubs in the United States. The 1956 flight was scheduled as a routine service northward, linking Lima with destinations beyond the Andes. On board were passengers, crew, and commercial cargo, a mixture of business travelers, families, and freight, all bound for the next leg of a familiar journey. The aircraft lifted from Lima's runway in the evening hours, its four-piston engines climbing steadily into the thin coastal air. Weather reports painted a mixed picture. Along the shoreline, skies were relatively calm, but inland clouds were gathering. Seasonal storms rose over the Andes, with convective build-ups that could climb to towering heights. Pilots along similar routes reported lightning visible far to the east, flashing intermittently like faint beacons on the horizon. For the first hours, everything proceeded as expected. The crew filed position reports with a calm, professional tone. Then, sometime after midnight, the rhythm of communication broke. A final transmission came through, its words trailing off mid-sentence. Operators listening on the ground noted the abrupt silence. Calls were made back to the aircraft, but no reply came. The DC-4 was gone. Search operations began at once. Peru's rugged geography posed enormous challenges. Teams of aircraft swept coastal approaches, while ground patrols pushed into dense jungle and steep mountain valleys. Rivers were followed for signs of floating wreckage. Shorelines were checked for debris, but day after day the effort returned nothing. No oil slicks, no scorched trees, no scattered metal across a ridge. Inquiries reviewed the possibilities. A catastrophic in-flight failure could have silenced the aircraft instantly, But the DC-4 was known for its durability. Weather-related disorientation was another theory. If the crew encountered storms while navigating by instruments alone, a gradual drift into terrain was possible. Yet no crash site was ever located. Even remote mountain villages, accustomed to the silence of high passes, reported nothing unusual that night. No explosion, no falling light, no sudden thunder beyond the storm. Weeks stretched into months, and the search area widened. International assistance joined the effort. Naval vessels combed the Pacific approaches in case the DC-4 had turned back toward the sea. Inland, new expeditions traced narrow canyons and snowfields where an aircraft could have disappeared without notice. Still, the silence endured. For Pan American Airways, the loss was deeply unsettling. Unlike disappearances over vast oceans, this one had occurred near populated regions, within range of both sea and mountain patrols. The absence of even a single trace confounded investigators. Official records closed the file with the stark designation, "Aircraft missing, presumed lost." In the years that followed, speculation grew. Some argued the DC-4 must have plunged into the high Andes, hidden beneath permanent snowfields. Others believed it had gone down in the thick Amazon basin, swallowed by forests so dense that wreckage could remain concealed indefinitely. A few pointed to the interrupted radio call as evidence of something more abrupt: a fire, a structural breakup, or a sudden onboard crisis. Yet without wreckage, each theory remained only a shadow. Families received no closure. Relatives continued to wonder whether their loved ones lay hidden on a mountainside or buried beneath vines and riverbanks waiting for discovery that never came. Today, more than half a century later, the disappearance of Pan Am's DC-4 remains one of South America's enduring mysteries. Somewhere between the Pacific coast and the towering Andes, an airliner full of lives simply dissolved into cloud, and until the mountains or the jungle decide to give up their secret, the 1956 flight will remain a question mark suspended in silence. In 1954, a Lockheed Super Constellation vanished en route from Germany to Brazil. Decades later, rumours surfaced of the aircraft reappearing empty on a deserted airstrip. While investigators call it folklore, the myth endures, an echo of how the sky arises. The Lockheed Super Constellation was an icon of mid-20th century aviation. With its triple-tail silhouette and long, elegant fuselage, it was the backbone of transoceanic routes in the years before jetliners. In the mid-1950s, these aircraft routinely carried passengers between Europe and South America, linking ports like Hamburg, Lisbon, and Rio de Janeiro. One such flight, remembered today as Flight 513, lifted from West Germany on a full morning in 1954, bound across the Atlantic with dozens of passengers and crew. The flight progressed smoothly in its early hours. Radio checks placed the aircraft over the Atlantic, climbing steadily into the cruise portion of its journey. Crews on other flights reported seeing the constellation in the distance, its polished aluminum glinting in the sun. Then somewhere beyond the horizon, it disappeared. The last routine position report was filed. After that, nothing. Search operations began quickly, as was customary in the post-war era. Aircraft from both Europe and Brazil traced expected routes, while ships scanned for debris along the mid-Atlantic. But no oil slick, no floating wreckage, and no bodies were ever found. After weeks of effort, officials declared the flight lost, presumed to have gone down in heavy seas. Families mourned, and Pan American and other carriers continued their schedules. For most accidents, official files eventually close. But for Flight 513, the story refused to end. In the 1980s, reports began to circulate of something uncanny. That a Lockheed Super Constellation had appeared on an abandoned runway in Brazil, engines silent, doors sealed, and the cabin completely empty. No official record confirms this event, but the tale spread quickly, passed from newspaper columns to radio talk shows and finally into aviation lore. The legend claimed that investigators who entered the aircraft found no passengers, no crew, and no personal effects. Some said the cabin appeared frozen in time, as if it had simply leapt forward decades into the future. Others suggested that skeletal remains were discovered strapped in their seats, an image that fueled ghost story retellings but lacked any documented source. Aviation authorities in Brazil dismissed the story as rumour, but the myth had already taken hold. Part of what gave the tale traction was the resonance of its details. The mid-Atlantic has a long history of vanishings, from cargo ships to passenger flights. The Lockheed Constellation itself was a reliable but complex aircraft with piston engines that could fail suddenly. If Flight 513 had indeed gone down, its wreckage could easily have sunk beneath deep ocean waters, unrecoverable with the technology of its day. That much is plausible. But the reappearance decades later remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Historians and investigators classify the ghost reappearance as folklore, a story built around the real disappearance of a 1950s airliner, shaped by human need to explain what cannot be confirmed. Yet even as myth, it illustrates something powerful: how the silence of the sky leaves room for imagination. When no wreckage is found, when official reports end with cause unknown, space opens for legends to take root. For families who lost loved ones on Flight 513, the myth may have offered a strange form of comfort, however implausible. To imagine the aircraft returning even as an empty shell felt less final than a disappearance without trace. Today, aviation historians emphasize the importance of separating fact from folklore. The fact is clear. In 1954, a super constellation vanished over the Atlantic, and it has never been recovered. The folklore of an empty aircraft landing decades later belongs to the realm of story. But sometimes the persistence of a myth is its own clue. It tells us that when the sky erases without leaving evidence, people will keep searching for meaning in the silence. And so, whether fact or fable, the tale of Flight 513 still drifts across the years, half history, half echo, an unfinished story of an airliner that vanished, and perhaps, in memory at least, returned. For decades after the disappearance of Stardust, climbers on Mount Tupungato spoke of metallic shards emerging from the ice. In 2000, full wreckage was confirmed. Yet even in discovery, the coded message Stendek defied resolution. On August 2, 1947, the British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian named Stardust left Buenos Aires bound for Santiago, Chile. The crew consisted of 6 men, including Captain Reginald Cook, a Royal Air Force veteran, and there were 5 passengers aboard. The flight was routine, one of many linking South America's capitals. The weather forecast, however, called for heavy cloud and turbulence over the Andes. At 1:46 p.m, Stardust departed. For much of its journey, the flight proceeded normally. Radio reports were sent, navigation points were checked, and all seemed in order. Then, as the aircraft approached Santiago, it transmitted one final message: ETA 1745 Stendek. The tower, puzzled, asked for clarification. Twice more, the crew repeated the word Stendek, then silence. When the aircraft failed to arrive, Chilean and Argentine search teams scoured mountain passes, valleys and snowfields. The Andes are unforgiving terrain, jagged peaks, shifting glaciers and sudden storms. After days of effort, no sign was found. It was as if Stardust had simply vanished into the mountain. For half a century, the mystery endured. Climbers on Mount Tupungato occasionally reported seeing strange objects glinting through the ice, metal fragments, scraps of fabric, but nothing conclusive. Families of the 11 aboard were left without closure, haunted by both the disappearance and the unexplainable word logged by Santiago's radio operator. In 1998, everything changed. An expedition climbing Tupungato stumbled upon wreckage, twisted aluminum, a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and scattered human remains preserved by ice. Over the following years, as glaciers retreated, more pieces emerged: uniform fragments, instruments, and sections of fuselage. Investigators pieced together the final moments. Analysis suggested that Stardust had struck the glacier at high speed, buried instantly by snow and avalanche. For decades, the wreckage lay entombed, slowly carried downhill by the movement of the ice until it was revealed by the melting. Yet while the discovery answered where the aircraft had gone, it did not explain why. The official conclusion was that the crew miscalculated their position, believing they had already cleared the Andes and begun descent towards Santiago. In reality, cloud cover and turbulence concealed the peaks ahead. Flying blind, they descended into the mountain itself. And still, the puzzle of Stendek remains. Aviation historians have debated its meaning for decades. Some suggest it was a garbled Morse code transmission of the word descent. Others propose it was shorthand used by British crews, standard en route descent clearance. Yet neither explanation fits neatly. The repetition of the word 3 times implies intent rather than error. Radio operators swore they heard it clearly, but no other crew before or since ever used the term. Today, the wreckage of Stardust lies in fragments on Mount Tupungato, occasionally uncovered by the glacier's slow retreat. Each summer, new shards appear, a shoe sole, a logbook fragment, a strip of canvas. The mountain seems to return the aircraft in pieces, reluctant to reveal the whole story at once. The discovery provided closure to some families, confirming that their loved ones had not vanished into myth, but into ice. Yet the unanswered word, recorded carefully in Santiago's log, ensures that the mystery lingers, because even when metal and bone return, a single unexplained signal can keep a story alive. And on Mount Tupungato, the silence of the glacier still holds echoes of the word Stendek. October 1972, a chartered Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild struck a mountain ridge, stranding survivors in snowbound silence. Their ordeal lasted 72 days. While rescue brought closure, strange unanswered details, unheard signals, odd compass shifts, kept the file from ever fully closing. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH-227D, carrying a rugby team, their friends and family members from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile. On board were 45 people. The pilots, Colonel Julio Ferradas and Lieutenant Colonel Dante Lagarara, were seasoned aviators, accustomed to mountain routes, but crossing the Andes always carried risk. Weather could change in minutes, valleys looked alike from the air, and the thin mountain atmosphere left little margin for error. On October 13, 1972, the aircraft departed. Mendoza, Argentina, heading west. Clouds covered much of the route. Navigation was primarily by dead reckoning timing and compass, as onboard equipment lacked the sophistication of modern GPS. The crew believed they had cleared the Andes when in reality the aircraft was still over high peaks. At 3:34 p.m, the Fairchild struck a ridge. The tail section tore away and the fuselage skidded down a glacier before slamming to a halt against ice and rock. 12 died in the initial impact. Others were gravely injured. In the hours that followed, survivors pulled each other from the wreckage, wrapping themselves in torn upholstery and using shattered fuselage walls as shelter. Outside, temperatures plunged below freezing. The thin air made breathing difficult. Snow buried much of the wreckage, sealing them into silence. For the next days, the survivors endured with almost no supplies. They melted snow for water and rationed the meagre food salvaged from the wreck. A few chocolate bars, bottles of wine, and handfuls of nuts. Soon, desperation forced them to make decisions few could imagine. To live, they resorted to consuming the preserved bodies of those who had died. A choice later revealed publicly, shocking the world, but understood as the only means of survival. Meanwhile, search teams in Argentina and Chile scoured the mountains. Radio operators logged faint transmissions, some believed to be distress signals from Flight 571, but none were confirmed. Poor weather hampered visibility. After 10 days, the official search was called off. Families were told no one could have survived. But in the wreckage, 33 people were still alive. They endured avalanches, illness, and bitter cold. Compass bearings taken by amateur rescuers among the survivors often seemed to shift inexplicably, adding confusion to their attempts to orient themselves. Their improvised radio failed to make contact, though some survivors later claimed that signals had been sent but never answered. By December, with food exhausted, two young men, Fernando Parado and Roberto Canessa, set out on foot. Clad in makeshift boots and clothing stitched from insulation, they trekked for 10 days across ridges and glaciers. Finally, on December 20th, they encountered a Chilean herdsman who alerted authorities. The remaining survivors were rescued on December the 23rd, 72 days after the crash. In total, 16 had endured the ordeal. The world hailed their survival as miraculous, but mysteries lingered in the official file. Some investigators questioned why the crew misjudged their position so fatally, descending into peaks still far from Santiago. Others puzzled over the reports of weak but unexplained radio signals logged during the search period. A handful of survivors even described compasses behaving strangely, as if mountain magnetism disrupted bearings. None of these details could be confirmed, yet they left traces of ambiguity in an otherwise heroic tale. Today, the story of Flight 571 is remembered both as tragedy and testament to endurance. The wreckage still lies on the glacier, slowly sinking into ice, a silent memorial. The rescue closed one chapter, but another remains open, one marked by odd signals, compass shifts, and questions that the Andes have never answered. November 8, 1969, Japan Airlines Flight 967 ADC-9 lifted into calm weather. Less than an hour later, radar lost contact. Wreckage washed ashore in fragments, but the main fuselage was never found. The Pacific had hidden the truth again. The Japan Airlines DC-9 was operating a domestic flight across the Pacific corridor linking Japan's main islands. The short-haul jet, with twin engines mounted at the rear and a reputation for reliability, was the backbone of regional routes worldwide. On board were passengers making routine journeys, business travellers, families and crew who had flown the route many times. The aircraft left Tokyo's Handa Airport in the late afternoon. Weather along the intended route was benign. Visibility was good, with only scattered clouds. Radar tracked the aircraft steadily as it climbed to cruising altitude. For the first 30 minutes, all seemed normal. Then, without warning, the blip representing Flight 967 flickered and disappeared from radar screens. Air traffic controllers attempted repeated radio calls. No answer came. Other aircraft in the vicinity reported no sign of distress. No calls overheard on emergency frequencies, and no unusual weather. It was as if the DC-9 had simply ceased to exist in mid-air. Search and rescue operations began immediately. The Japanese Maritime Safety Agency deployed ships, while military aircraft swept the skies and sea lanes. Within hours, small pieces of debris were found: floating seat cushions, life jackets, and fragments of cabin structure. These finds confirmed the aircraft had broken apart, but the main fuselage remained missing. No bodies were recovered in the first days of searching. Investigators faced an immediate challenge. With only scattered fragments, they could not determine whether the aircraft had suffered an in-flight explosion, structural failure, or a sudden descent into the ocean. The calm weather made the loss even more perplexing. Typically, severe turbulence or storms were blamed in early reports, but this time conditions had been stable. Weeks later, additional debris washed ashore along Japan's Pacific coast. Bits of luggage, torn insulation, and wiring confirmed the aircraft had struck the water at high speed, but no flight recorders were ever recovered. At the time, not all regional DC-9s carried the modern black boxes now considered standard, leaving investigators with little more than witness reports and drift calculations. The official inquiry concluded that the aircraft likely suffered a catastrophic event, possibly mechanical failure or explosion, but could not determine a precise cause. Without engines, wings, or cockpit sections to study, every hypothesis remained incomplete. For the families of the passengers, the lack of definitive answers was devastating. They received fragments of personal belongings, but no explanation for the sudden silence that had ended the flight. For the airline, the loss marked a sobering reminder of how quickly even a modern jet could vanish over water. In later years, speculation ranged widely. Some experts suggested an undetected structural fatigue in the DC-9's fuselage, a risk in early variants of the type. Others pointed to possible fuel tank ignition, a scenario that had caused similar losses elsewhere in the 1960s. Still others questioned whether a navigational error led the aircraft off course and into the sea at night. But with the fuselage never found, none of these theories could be proven. The Pacific Ocean had swallowed the crucial evidence, hiding it beneath depths too vast for recovery. Today, the loss of Flight 967 is less well remembered than other high-profile disappearances, yet it remains one of Japan's enduring aviation mysteries. Calm skies, no distress call, and fragments without a body of wreckage all combine to leave the file marked "Cause Unknown." And so the Pacific keeps its silence. Families received belongings, historians received theories, but the sea held the truth. Somewhere beneath those waters lies the rest of the DC-9, still intact enough to explain what happened, waiting, perhaps forever beyond reach. TUA Flight 800, The Sky's Sudden Fire, July 17, 1996. 12 minutes after takeoff from New York, TWA 800 exploded mid-air. Official reports blame a center fuel tank ignition, but radar tapes and eyewitnesses describing streaks of light left the event edged with persistent unease. The aircraft was a Boeing 747-100, one of the early models of the iconic jumbo jet. That evening, it was scheduled to fly from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York to Paris. On board were 230 people, passengers and crew beginning an overnight transatlantic crossing. Among them were families travelling for summer holidays, students studying abroad, and seasoned flight attendants who had worked the route many times before. At 8:19 p.m. local time, Flight 800 departed JFK, climbing steadily into clear skies over Long Island. Weather conditions were ideal, warm, calm, with only light haze along the horizon. Controllers tracked the 747 on radar as it ascended through 13,000 feet. Then at 8:31 p.m, something catastrophic occurred. The radar returns split into fragments. Moments later, witnesses along the coast reported a fireball in the sky. More than 200 people across Long Island described what they saw. Some spoke of a streak of light rising toward the aircraft, followed by an explosion. Others reported a sudden flash aboard the jet itself with no precursor. Boats in the area saw flaming debris raining down into the Atlantic, creating multiple smaller fires on the water. Within minutes, search and rescue teams were mobilized, but no survivors were found. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an exhaustive investigation, one of the largest in aviation history. Divers recovered thousands of pieces of wreckage from the seabed and painstakingly reconstructed the aircraft in a hangar. Their analysis centered on the center wing fuel tank. Tests suggested that vaporized fuel combined with faulty wiring could have ignited explosively. Over time, investigators concluded this was the most probable cause, but controversy never faded. The eyewitness accounts of streaks of light, consistent with what some interpreted as a missile, became the subject of intense debate. Radar records showed unexplained blips near the aircraft at the time of the explosion. Independent analysts and former officials questioned whether the NTSB's conclusion fully explained the disaster. The FBI initially pursued a criminal investigation, considering terrorism, but found no evidence of explosives on recovered wreckage. The official report, released in 2000, closed the file with the ruling: an explosion of the center wing fuel tank resulting from flammable fuel, vapors ignited by a short circuit. Yet the unusual combination of eyewitness reports, radar anomalies, and the sudden nature of the blast left many unconvinced. In response to the investigation, sweeping safety changes were made. Aircraft manufacturers redesigned fuel systems to prevent vapor buildup, and airlines implemented stricter wiring inspections. These changes have made modern fuel tank explosions virtually impossible. In that sense, Flight 800 reshaped aviation safety worldwide. Still, for families of the victims, the lingering questions compound the grief. Many accepted the NTSB's technical explanation, but others believe the full truth remains hidden. Books, documentaries, and hearings have kept the alternative theories alive, ensuring that Flight 800 is remembered not only as tragedy but also as controversy. Today, the reconstructed fuselage of TWA-800 remains stored at a training facility, used to teach accident investigation techniques. It is a somber reminder of the lives lost, the lessons learned, and the mysteries unresolved. WA-800 officially ended in a spark within a fuel tank. Unofficially, it remains edged by uncertainty. Whether the streaks of light were misperceptions or glimpses of something never fully explained. And as the Atlantic waves continue to roll over the place where the debris once burned, the silence leaves open a space for questions still unanswered. The Icelandic C-47 that vanished twice. During World War II, a US C-47 vanished on a ferry route to Iceland. Weeks later, wreckage surfaced. Decades later, the glacier swallowed it whole again. To this day, shifting ice alternately reveals and conceals the remains. The Douglas C-47, a military adaptation of the DC-3, was one of the most important workhorses of the Second World War. Rugged, reliable, and capable of landing on rough airstrips, it ferried men and supplies across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the world. In the North Atlantic, C-47s formed a vital link in the ferry chain, carrying aircraft, equipment, and crews between North America and Europe. In late 1944, one such flight departed from Greenland on a scheduled hop to Reykjavik, Iceland. The crew was composed of young American servicemen trained for the harsh Arctic conditions. They carried mail, spare parts, and personal effects bound for the European theatre. The weather at departure was cold but manageable. Low clouds, steady winds, and visibility sufficient for navigation. Somewhere over Iceland's interior, however, the aircraft disappeared. No distress calls were received. Radar coverage was minimal in the 1940s, leaving searchers with little more than last known bearings and rough calculations of fuel endurance. For days, nothing was found. Icelandic villagers scanned the skies and listened for engines, but the island remained silent. Then, weeks later, mountaineers on Vatnajökull, the vast glacier covering much of southeast Iceland, came across twisted metal protruding from the ice. The wreckage was unmistakably a C-47. Scattered debris and partial remains confirmed the fate of the missing aircraft. Recovery efforts were limited by weather, and much of the fuselage was left in place, eventually claimed by snow and ice. The glacier, however, did not keep still. Over the decades, its surface shifted, moved, and crept. The wreck was slowly drawn deeper into the frozen mass. What had once been a visible scar on the surface became buried beneath tens of meters of ice. By the 1960s, nothing remained to mark the site. In later years, fragments began to reappear. Glaciologists and hikers reported occasional finds, bits of aluminum, corroded engines, and worn boots emerging from crevasses. Each discovery hinted at the frozen tomb below, where the majority of the aircraft still lay. Local folklore grew around the site, a plane that had vanished twice, once into war and once into ice. For the US military, the wreck was recorded in official files as a war loss, with cause listed as weather and terrain. Navigation in those days relied heavily on dead reckoning, magnetic compasses, and occasional celestial fixes, methods easily disrupted by Iceland's volatile weather and shifting winds. A sudden downdraft or miscalculation could have forced the C-47 into the glacier's unforgiving slopes. Yet the story continues to fascinate not because of its cause, but because of its recurrence. Even in modern times, with satellites and GPS, Vatnajökull occasionally gives up fragments of the past. Aluminum shards appear after summer melts, only to be covered again by winter snow. Each year, the glacier seems to decide anew how much of the wreck to reveal. For families of the lost crew, the glacier's silence has been both a memorial and a barrier. Without full recovery, closure remains partial, the final moments left to imagination. The men remain entombed, guardians of a site that resists full discovery. The Icelandic C-47 is remembered not simply as a wartime loss, but as a reminder of how landscapes themselves can erase history. First the war consumed the plane, then the ice concealed it. And still, as the glacier advances and retreats, the wreck flickers between presence and absence, never fully gone, never fully found. In this way, the aircraft has not vanished once, but twice, and perhaps many more times still to come. In June 1950, Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 2505 fought blizzard winds over Ontario. The pilot radioed once, requesting a new heading. Then the channel went dead. In the morning, only a crater in the forest remained. No voices, no explanations. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, dependable four-engine transport widely used after World War II for passenger routes across North America. On board that night were 21 people, crew and passengers making the journey from Vancouver to Toronto. The flight was scheduled to arrive in the early hours, following a route over the vast forests and lakes of northern Ontario. Weather across the region was turbulent. Late spring storms rolled through, combining snow squalls with strong crosswinds. Reports from other aircraft in the area warned of heavy turbulence and icing conditions. Flight 2505 pressed on into the weather system, guided by radio navigation beacons and periodic reports relayed to controllers on the ground. At 3 a.m, the pilot transmitted a brief message, requesting a revised heading to avoid worsening weather. His tone was calm, professional, showing no urgency. Controllers acknowledged, preparing to issue instructions, but before the exchange could continue, the channel went silent. No distress call followed, no signal of technical failure, just an empty frequency. Through the rest of the night, radio operators called repeatedly, but Flight 2505 never replied. As dawn broke, search aircraft began scouring the wilderness below the planned route. Northern Ontario offered a formidable challenge: dense boreal forests, countless lakes, and limited roads into the interior. From the air, even large wreckage could be hidden beneath the canopy. Later that morning, smoke was spotted rising from the forest floor. Teams on foot and by air converged on the site. What they found stunned investigators. Instead of scattered wreckage across a wide debris field, the DC-4 had left a single crater. The aircraft had plunged almost vertically into the ground, carving a deep wound into the forest floor. Debris was compacted into the earth, much of it unrecognizable. There were no survivors. The scene raised troubling questions. A typical mid-air breakup or controlled crash landing would have left debris spread across a wide area, with fuselage sections intact enough for examination. But Flight 2505 appeared to have struck at high speed, nose down, as though driven directly into the ground. Investigators combed through what could be salvaged. Engines showed signs of normal power at impact, ruling out sudden engine failure. Instruments and control cables were too badly damaged to offer conclusive evidence. Weather was the most immediate suspect. Whiteout conditions, turbulence, and icing could have disoriented the crew. But even then, why no mayday? Why no partial call for help? The official report concluded that severe weather and pilot disorientation were the most likely cause. Yet the abruptness of the final minutes continued to trouble analysts. Some speculated that structural icing might have overwhelmed the aircraft, causing a sudden stall. Others suggested an electrical failure that cut communications just as the crew lost control. Without black boxes still years away from being mandated, no definitive sequence could be reconstructed. For the families, the crater in the forest became the only answer, a sudden silence followed by this impact. The site, remote and difficult to reach, was eventually reclaimed by trees and snow. Today, little remains to mark where Flight 2505 ended, but the questions endure. Why was the last transmission so calm with no hint of urgency? What happened in the gap between that request for a new heading and the final plunge into the Earth? In the silent forests of northern Ontario, the crater filled slowly with water, moss, and roots. Nature covered over the scar. Yet beneath the soil lies a story never fully told, of a flight erased in seconds, leaving behind only silence where voices once were. This US Army charter is listed as one of the most exhaustive sea searches ever mounted. Aircraft, ships, submarines, all combed the Pacific for days. The only evidence was silence itself, leaving families with nothing to bury. The flight in question was Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed Super Constellation leased by the US military during the Vietnam War era. On board were 93 soldiers bound for Saigon and 11 civilian crew. Their mission was straightforward: ferry personnel across the Pacific, linking American bases in Guam, the Philippines, and onward into Southeast Asia. On March 16, 1962, the aircraft departed Guam in the early hours. Weather conditions were excellent: clear skies, calm seas, and good visibility. After several routine position reports, controllers expected another transmission as the aircraft neared the halfway point of its leg. But the next scheduled report never came. Radar showed nothing unusual. Then the Super Constellation simply vanished. Search and rescue efforts began within hours. The US military mobilized a massive operation. 48 aircraft, 8 ships, and more than 1,300 personnel combed 200,000 square miles of ocean. Submarines listened for signals from possible emergency beacons. Patrol aircraft flew tight search patterns over the Pacific, watching for oil slicks or debris. For nearly a week, the effort continued. Nothing surfaced. Then came a single haunting report. The crew of the SSTL Lenson, an oil tanker, testified that around the time of the disappearance they had observed a bright flash of light high in the night sky, followed by a fading glow. They believed they had witnessed an explosion. Their account was logged and passed to investigators, but no debris field was ever located to confirm it. For families of the 104 people on board, the lack of evidence was unbearable. Without wreckage, there were no remains to return, no funerals with coffins, only memorials in absentia. To this day, no physical trace of Flight 739 has been identified. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated but found little to conclude. The official record lists the disappearance as cause unknown. Theories ranged from catastrophic mechanical failure to sabotage, but without wreckage or survivors, each possibility remained speculative. The suggestion of an in-flight explosion, supported by the oil tanker's testimony, could not be ruled out, yet it could not be proven either. Over the years, Flight 739 became one of the many mysteries of the Vietnam War era, an event overshadowed by the larger conflict but still deeply painful for those who lost loved ones. In 2019, nearly 6 decades later, the names of the passengers and crew were finally inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., recognizing their loss as part of the broader war effort. And still, the Pacific keeps its secret. The ocean is vast, with depths that can swallow entire aircraft beyond reach of mid-20th century technology. Even modern sonar mapping has yet to uncover the super constellation's final resting place. Some historians suggest the wreckage may lie in trenches more than 20,000 feet below the surface. Others note that currents could have dispersed debris far beyond the original search grid, yet for the families, technical explanations bring little comfort. What endures is the silence. No distress call, no floating wreckage, no survivor accounts. An aircraft carrying more than 100 souls lifted into a clear sky and never returned. The Pacific is often called the Silent Ocean, and in the case of Flight 739, the silence has lasted more than 60 years. What remains is only memory, the faint testimony of a flash seen from the deck of a tanker, and the enduring ache of questions that will likely never be answered. In November 1965, a private Cessna flying from Fort Lauderdale to Nassau vanished in perfect weather. Air traffic heard to routine chatter, but halfway across, the voice stopped. The wreckage never appeared, adding to the pattern of disappearances in the region. The aircraft was a Cessna 210, a small single-engine plane often used for personal travel and charter flights across the Caribbean. The route from Florida to the Bahamas was short, less than 200 miles, and on clear days pilots could often see the outline of islands well before they arrived. By the mid-1960s, the air corridor between Fort Lauderdale and Nassau was one of the busiest in the Western Hemisphere, with commercial airlines, military patrols, and private aircraft sharing the skies. On the morning of November the 3rd, the Cessna departed Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport with 2 people on board: the pilot, an experienced flyer familiar with island routes, and 1 passenger. Weather briefings forecast calm winds, excellent visibility, and no significant cloud cover. It was, by all accounts, an ideal day for flying. Air traffic control tracked the Cessna as it climbed to its assigned altitude of 5,500 feet. The pilot's radio transmissions were routine: position reports, altitude confirmations, and a brief acknowledgement of the clear weather. Controllers noted nothing unusual in his tone or manner. About 40 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft reached the midpoint between Florida and Nassau, the expected position report never arrived. Controllers repeated calls on emergency frequencies. No reply. Other aircraft in the same corridor attempted to raise the Cessna, but the airwaves remained silent. Search and rescue began quickly. The US Coast Guard dispatched aircraft and cutters sweeping the direct route between Florida and the Bahamas. Commercial pilots were asked to scan for oil slicks or debris as they crossed the same waters. Civil Air Patrol units joined the search, covering secondary routes in case the Cessna had diverted. Despite clear weather and calm seas, not a single trace of wreckage was located. Investigators considered possible causes. A sudden mechanical failure, such as an engine seizure, could have forced the pilot to ditch. But in calm seas, wreckage would normally float, visible to rescuers. A controlled descent should also have allowed time for a distress call. The total silence remained puzzling. Another possibility was spatial disorientation, a common risk when flying small aircraft over open water. Without clear visual references, pilots can become confused about altitude or attitude, inadvertently flying into the sea. Yet the pilot was experienced, and on that day the horizon was distinct. The loss soon entered the growing lore of the Bermuda Triangle, a region increasingly associated in the 1960s with unexplained vanishings. The disappearance of Flight 19 in 1945, followed by commercial and private aircraft in the years after, gave the region a reputation for mysteries unsolved. The 1965 Cessna case fit the pattern precisely: clear skies, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and no wreckage. For the families of those aboard, the absence of evidence left only questions. With no debris, no recovered remains, and no definitive explanation, they could only mark the date as the day their loved ones vanished into air and sea. Today, aviation historians caution against overstating the mystery. They note that small aircraft accidents over water often leave little trace, particularly if the wreck sinks intact. Yet the disappearance remains striking for its conditions: perfect weather, a reliable aircraft, and a pilot in full control until the moment the radio went dead. And so the case remains, another thread in a long line of vanishings over the waters east of Florida. A flight measured in miles and minutes ended instead in silence, with nothing to mark its passage but unanswered calls on an empty frequency. The Bermuda Triangle does not always require storms to claim an aircraft. Sometimes, as in 1965, it needs only the quiet of a clear sky. crews reported unusual magnetic fluctuations in the area. The wreck has never been located in the mountain's shifting snow. The Curtiss C-46 was a rugged, twin-engine transport built to haul cargo and troops through some of the most unforgiving skies of World War II. Larger than the famous C-47, it carried heavy loads over high altitudes, making it essential to one of the war's most perilous missions, the aerial supply route across the Himalayas, known simply as the Hump. The Hump was not a single corridor, but a vast expanse of jagged ridges, ice fields and valleys, myriads stretching between northern India and southwestern China. Flying over it was among the most dangerous assignments Allied crews faced. Engines strained in thin air, storms formed without warning, and navigation often relied on dead reckoning through cloud and snow. Between 1942 and 1945, hundreds of aircraft were lost in this region, some to weather, others to mechanical failure, and many to the mountains themselves. In November 1943, one such flight departed from Assam, India, bound for Kunming, China. The crew carried military supplies, food, ammunition, and spare parts critical to supporting Chinese forces. Reports from other aircraft that day described unusually strong headwinds and erratic compass readings. Crews noted that magnetic needles swung unpredictably, sometimes deviating by 10 to 20 degrees. In a landscape where peaks rose to more than 16,000 feet, such errors could prove fatal. The C-46 checked in with the routine transmissions early in its journey. Nothing seemed amiss. Then, as it crossed deeper into the mountain range, silence fell. Calls went unanswered. Radar coverage was non-existent in the region at the time, leaving no trace of the aircraft's last position. Search efforts were immediate but limited by conditions. Ground parties struggled against snowstorms, avalanches, and terrain that resisted even experienced mountaineers. Aircraft scouted valleys and ridgelines, but visibility was poor. Days later, the mission was officially suspended. The mountains had swallowed the C-46, as they had so many others. Over the years, scattered reports of wreckage sightings emerged. In the 1960s, climbers claimed to have seen metal fragments high on a glacier, only to lose the trail in shifting ice. In the 1990s, villagers in Arunachal Pradesh described aircraft debris found after a landslide. But when officials investigated, no conclusive evidence was recovered. Each lead seemed to vanish as quickly as it surfaced. Scientists studying the region confirmed that magnetic anomalies were real. The Himalayas contain iron-rich formations capable of distorting compasses. Combined with severe turbulence, icing, and unreliable early navigation equipment, these anomalies created a perfect storm for disorientation. Pilots described instruments swinging wildly even on clear days. Still, the complete disappearance of the C-46 remains puzzling. Unlike other crashes where wreckage was eventually discovered, this aircraft left no confirmed trace. Some historians suggest it lies buried deep within glacial ice, slowly being carried downhill, only to emerge centuries later. Others believe it may have gone down in an inaccessible valley where snow and landslides concealed all evidence. The fate of its crew, young men on a dangerous but routine supply run, remains unknown. Their families never received bodies for burial, only telegrams marked missing in action. For them, the Hump route carried not just supplies, but a heavy human cost. Today, hikers and researchers occasionally recover fragments of wartime aircraft from the Himalayas, aluminum panels, propellers, and faded uniforms. Each discovery reminds us that the mountains still hold countless stories beneath their snow. But the C-46 of 1943 remains among those still hidden, its journey ending in silence. And in the thin air above the Himalayas, compasses still flicker, echoing the mystery of flights lost to peaks and storms long ago. Crew aboard a tanker claimed to see a bright flash at altitude where Flight 739 should have been. Investigators logged the testimony but could not reconcile it with radar data. The light remained unexplained. The tanker was the SSTL Lenzen, a civilian-operated vessel sailing the Pacific under contract to the US military. On the night of the March 16, 1962, its crew stood watch over the calm seas, logging routine entries in the ship's record. At 1:30 a.m, the lookout reported an unusual sight, a flare of brilliant light high above the horizon. Others on deck confirmed it, describing a streak or burst that illuminated the sky before fading into darkness. At that very hour, flying Tiger-Line Flight 739 was scheduled to be overhead. The Lockheed Super Constellation, carrying 93 US soldiers and 11 crew, had departed Guam just before midnight, bound for the Philippines. The flight had been routine, calm weather, clear skies, steady progress. But its expected position report due around the time of the sighting never arrived. The testimony of the tanker's crew quickly became central to the investigation. Their accounts were consistent. The light appeared suddenly, lasted only seconds, and seemed to originate at high altitude. Yet no radar station in the region recorded an anomaly. No military installations reported unusual activity. The skies were otherwise quiet. The US military launched one of the most intensive search operations of the Cold War era. 48 aircraft and 8 naval vessels scoured more than 200,000 square miles of ocean. Submarines were tasked with listening for acoustic signals from possible wreckage. The search continued for days. Not a single piece of debris was found. The tanker's report raised troubling questions. Could Flight 739 have suffered a catastrophic mid-air explosion, witnessed from the sea but invisible to radar? Or was the flash unrelated, a meteor breaking up in the atmosphere at the same moment? Investigators could not rule out either possibility. Some analysts pointed to the superconstellation's design. The aircraft's 4-piston engines relied on high-octane fuel, and its large tanks, if compromised, could ignite violently. A structural failure or fuel leak might have produced exactly the kind of flash seen by the tanker's crew. Yet in such a case, floating debris, seat cushions, rafts or oil slicks would normally have been found. The ocean remained empty. Others explored more unsettling scenarios. Sabotage was briefly considered. With the Vietnam conflict escalating, the aircraft's military passengers represented a strategic movement of forces, but no credible evidence of an onboard device was ever found, and the investigation closed without assigning responsibility. The lack of radar confirmation remains one of the enduring puzzles. If the flash had been a mid-air breakup, controllers expected to see a scatter of returns or sudden disappearance at a precise point. Instead, radar tapes showed only the gradual fading of the aircraft's signal, as though it had simply slipped from range. For the families of the lost, the tanker's testimony was both haunting and unsatisfying. It provided a possible final glimpse of the aircraft's fate, but no material proof. Without wreckage, there were no remains to bury, only memorial plaques and names etched into stone decades later. In aviation history, the flash has become a symbol of ambiguity, the thin line between observation and evidence. A handful of men on a dark deck saw something extraordinary, but the event left no trace beyond their words. Today, the Pacific still carries that silence. Somewhere beneath its surface may rest the superconstellation, its passengers, and the answers to what caused the sudden light. But until the ocean yields them, the flash reported by the Lenson's crew remains what it has always been, a brief glow against the night, fading into the mystery of an aircraft that never arrived. In 1969, a Soviet Antonov 24 went down in Siberia. The final radio call reported routine conditions. Hours later, the wreckage was found scattered and burned, but certain parts of the fuselage showed strange scoring marks unexplained by fire. The Antonov An-24 was a sturdy twin turboprop, built for short-haul flights in some of the harshest regions of the Soviet Union. Designed to withstand rugged airfields and extreme cold, it became a backbone of regional travel. On the evening of February 21, 1969, Flight 703 took off from Krasnoyarsk, bound for Irkutsk. On board were passengers and crew accustomed to Siberia's unforgiving winters. Weather conditions at departure were reported as stable. Winds were light, visibility reasonable, and temperatures frigid but within operational limits. The route across Siberia was long but routine, crossing vast expanses of taiga and snowbound rivers. Shortly after takeoff, the crew made a routine position report, confirming their heading and altitude. Their voices carried no hint of distress. That was the last transmission. When the aircraft failed to arrive at Irkutsk, search teams were dispatched. Soviet military and civilian aviation authorities coordinated flights across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The terrain below offered little assistance. Endless pine forests broken by icy ridges, much of it inaccessible by road. After hours of searching, a reconnaissance aircraft spotted smoke rising from a remote clearing. Ground teams arrived to find the wreckage scattered across a wide area. The Antonov had struck hard, breaking apart before fire consumed much of what remained. Of the people aboard, there were no survivors. Investigators moved quickly, as was standard procedure, securing the site and documenting debris before snow buried evidence. At first, the accident seemed like so many others attributed to weather, mechanical failures or pilot error. But closer inspection raised troubling questions. Certain sections of fuselage showed scoring marks, long, parallel grooves etched into the metal. These did not match patterns typical of fire damage or structural breakup. Some engineers suggested they resembled abrasions caused by external contact, though with what remained unclear. The engines, recovered from the wreckage, showed signs of normal operation up until impact. Propellers bore evidence of rotation, ruling out sudden engine failure. Instruments were too badly damaged to reconstruct cockpit activity. The flight's final radio call, calm and routine, gave no hint of what was to come. Unofficially, some searchers speculated about mid-air breakup. The wide scatter of wreckage suggested the Antonov may have disintegrated before impact. But again, no firm evidence supported this theory. The strange markings only deepened the mystery. In the absence of clear answers, the Soviet accident report attributed the crash to loss of control in unknown circumstances. It was a phrase often used when evidence proved inconclusive. Families were told their loved ones had perished in an unavoidable tragedy, but details remained sparse. Over time, speculation grew. Some argued that turbulence or icing could have caused a sudden stall. Siberian winters often produced invisible sheets of ice on wings, and even robust aircraft like the An-24 were vulnerable. Others suggested a navigational error that placed the aircraft into rising terrain. But the unexplained scoring marks lingered in memory. Were they caused by debris striking the fuselage during breakup? Could they have been the result of contact with trees before impact, distorted by fire, or did they point to something less easily explained, a detail buried by official silence? In the decades since, Flight 703 has remained a footnote in Soviet aviation history, overshadowed by larger disasters. Yet for those who study the case, the mystery endures. An aircraft flying in stable conditions, a routine call on the radio, and then silence followed by wreckage scarred in ways no fire could account for. And in the Siberian taiga, where the snow closes quickly over the past, the unanswered questions of Flight 703 still rest beneath the trees, etched in metal and left unresolved. The DC-3 that fell from sky without a sound, January 1948. A DC-3 travelling from Puerto Rico to Miami sent calm reports right up until 4 in the morning. Then nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no bodies. The silence itself became the lasting mystery. The Douglas DC-3 was one of the most successful aircraft designs of all time. By the late 1940s, it had carried millions of passengers around the world, celebrated for its reliability and forgiving handling. The aircraft on that January night belonged to Airborne Transport, operating Flight & Sea 16002 on a scheduled service from San Juan to Miami. On board were 29 passengers and 3 crew members, making a routine overnight crossing of the Caribbean. The DC-3 departed San Juan at 10:30 p.m, climbing steadily into clear skies. Conditions were reported as favourable, with only scattered clouds and light winds. Throughout the flight, the crew transmitted regular position reports. At 4 a.m, nearing Florida, the captain made a final calm transmission. They were on course, at altitude, with nothing unusual to report. Minutes later, silence fell. Controllers attempted repeated calls but received no reply. Other aircraft in the area also tried to reach the DC-3, but no voice answered. Radar, limited in coverage at the time, gave no definitive trace. The aircraft had simply disappeared somewhere over the dark waters of the Florida Straits. Search and rescue began at dawn. US Coast Guard cutters, Navy aircraft and civilian vessels swept the likely route. They expected at least some sign, floating debris, life jackets or an oil slick. Yet the sea gave back nothing. Day after day, search patterns widened, but no trace of the DC-3 was ever found. Investigators turned to the facts available. The final transmission suggested the crew were calm and unaware of any imminent danger. Weather records confirmed no storms in the immediate area. With no distress call, the possibility of sudden catastrophic failure was considered. But the DC-3 was a robust design, capable of flying even on one engine. The absence of debris complicated every theory. Speculation soon followed. Some suggested fuel exhaustion, though calculations showed sufficient reserves for the route. Others proposed structural failure, though the aircraft's maintenance records were within normal limits. The lack of wreckage ruled out nothing but confirmed nothing either. The disappearance quickly entered the growing lore of the Bermuda Triangle. Flight NC-16002 vanished in the same region where other aircraft and ships had been lost under eerily similar circumstances: calm skies, routine transmission, and sudden silence. The mystery deepened when searchers noted that even lightweight debris, seat cushions or life jackets, should have floated, yet none were ever recovered. Unofficial accounts hinted at electrical anomalies before takeoff. Maintenance crews reportedly noted issues with the aircraft's batteries and generator system in San Juan. Repairs were attempted, but whether the electrical system failed entirely mid-flight remains unknown. If power was lost, the crew might have been left with no radios, no lights, and limited instruments. Even then, a powerless DC-3 could glide, buying time for a distress call. Yet none came. For the families of the 32 aboard, the lack of closure was devastating. Memorials were held, but without remains, grief remained suspended. For decades, the case lingered as one of aviation's unresolved mysteries, cited in both official accident records and popular accounts of unexplained vanishings. Today, more than 70 years later, the Florida Straits still guard the secret of Flight NC-16002. No wreckage has ever been located, no final words beyond the calm voice at 4 a.m. And so the mystery endures. An aircraft that flew smoothly into the night, spoke once more and then was gone, leaving nothing but silence on the airwaves and empty sea below. The unfinished flight of 401, December 29, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Florida Everglades. While the cause was traced to crew distraction, for years after, flight attendants on other aircraft reported sightings of former crew members haunting their flights. The aircraft was a Lockheed L1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced wide-body jets of its time. On board were 163 passengers and 13 crew, bound from New York to Miami. The flight was routine until the final approach. At 11:32 p.m, as the jet descended toward Miami International Airport, the crew noticed that a landing gear indicator light had failed to illuminate. Unsure whether the nose gear was down, Captain Robert Loft and his crew entered a holding pattern over the Everglades. For the next minutes, the cockpit focused on the small green bulb. Engineers removed the light assembly, attempting to troubleshoot. During this time, the autopilot was inadvertently disengaged. The TriStar began a gradual descent unnoticed by the distracted crew. At 11:42 p.m, the aircraft struck the swamp at over 200 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart, scattering wreckage across the wetlands. Miraculously, 75 people survived, pulled from the wreckage by rescuers who braved mud and alligators to reach the crash site. But 101 lives were lost, including Captain Loft and flight engineer Donald Repo. The official investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was caused by failure of the flight crew to monitor flight instruments during a malfunction of the nose landing gear position indicator system. In short, a small burned-out bulb led to fatal distraction. But the story of Flight 401 did not end there. In the years following, rumours began to circulate among Eastern Airlines crews. Flight attendants reported seeing Captain Loft or Engineer Repo aboard other L1011 aircraft in service. Passengers too described conversations with uniformed men who vanished before takeoff. The reports grew specific. One flight attendant claimed to see Loft's reflection in a galley oven door. Another insisted Repo warned her about a pre-flight malfunction that was later confirmed by mechanics. Pilots reported a man in an engineer's uniform checking panels in the cockpit, identified later from photographs as Repo. Eastern Airlines management, wary of damaging publicity, discouraged discussion of the sightings, but within the airline, the tales became common knowledge. Whispered explanations circulated. Parts salvaged from Flight 401's wreckage had been reused in other TriStars, linking the aircraft spiritually to the lost crew. Mechanics confirmed that some galley and cockpit components had indeed been reinstalled on other jets. After the sightings, those parts were quietly removed. Officially, Eastern denied the stories. No logbooks recorded ghost encounters, and no evidence beyond testimony was ever presented. Skeptics argued that the trauma of the crash, combined with stress and fatigue among crews, created fertile ground for folklore, yet the consistency of the reports kept the story alive. Today, Flight 401 is remembered in two layers: the cold technical facts of a crash caused by distraction, and the haunting tales that followed. The Everglades site remains a somber memorial, a place where families and survivors gather each year. But in aviation lore, it is also the flight that seemed to linger. The ghosts of Loft and Repo are not recorded in official accident reports, yet their names are spoken in crew rooms and are sang those who still recall the era of the L1011. And so Flight 401 remains unfinished, its story divided between the swamp where it ended and the skies where, some say, the crew still walks the aisles of aircraft long retired. A Twin Otter supply flight lifted from McMurdo Station into Polar Cloud. Midway through the route, radar lost the signal. The wreck was later found, but ice shifts have buried much of it again, leaving questions about why the descent occurred. The de Havilland Canada DHC-6 Twin Otter is among the most dependable aircraft in the world, designed to handle rugged terrain, short takeoffs and extreme conditions. In Antarctica, it has long been a lifeline, carrying scientists, fuel and supplies between research stations. On January 23, 2013, one such aircraft lifted off from South Pole Station bound for an Italian outpost at Terra Nova Bay. On board were 3 experienced Canadian crew members. The weather at departure was challenging but considered manageable. Low cloud and gusting winds created whiteout conditions, common across the polar plateau, but the Twin Otter had flown countless missions under similar constraints. Its rugged airframe and skis allowed it to land on ice and snow where other aircraft could not. Approximately halfway into the flight, radio contact ceased. The crew gave no distress call, no hint of difficulty. Radar tracking also failed, leaving only the knowledge of their intended route across a vast frozen expanse. When the aircraft failed to arrive, emergency protocols were initiated. Search and rescue in Antarctica is unlike anywhere else. Aircraft from McMurdo and other bases attempted sweeps, but storms and low visibility slowed progress. Days later, a signal was picked up from the aircraft's emergency locator beacon confirming the Twin Otter had gone down in the Queen Alexandra Range. When recovery teams reached the site, they found wreckage scattered along a steep mountainside. The impact had been severe, with little chance of survival. All 3 crew members were lost. Investigators faced immediate difficulty. Sub-zero temperatures, shifting ice and dangerous crevasses limited access. Photographs and debris samples were collected, but full analysis proved difficult. Initial findings suggested the aircraft had descended unexpectedly into rising terrain. Yet why the descent occurred remained unclear. The Twin Otter's engines were found intact, with no signs of mechanical failure. Navigation equipment, though damaged, showed no obvious malfunction. Some experts proposed that whiteout conditions caused a loss of visual reference, leading to controlled flight into terrain. Others pointed to possible altimeter misreadings at high altitude, where atmospheric pressure can distort readings. The recovery site itself soon added to the mystery. Within months, shifting snow and ice began to bury the wreckage again. By the following year, much of the debris had vanished beneath drifts, locked in place by the moving glacier. Only a few scattered parts remained visible, reminders of how quickly Antarctica reclaims what falls upon it. For colleagues at McMurdo and Terra Nova, the loss was a somber reminder of the risks inherent to polar aviation. Even the most reliable aircraft flown by skilled crews could be overwhelmed by the environment. Yet the unanswered questions lingered. Why was no distress call made? Why did radar show no abrupt deviation, only a fading signal? In the years since, the story of the Twin Otter has become another of Antarctica's enigmas, an accident explained in part but never in full. Officially, the cause was attributed to controlled flight into terrain, a conclusion supported by the evidence available. But the circumstances, the silence of the crew, the suddenness of the descent, and the way the ice itself buried the remains, left room for unease. The glacier now holds the final fragments, carrying them slowly towards the sea over centuries. Beneath layers of snow, the aircraft lies preserved, its instruments frozen at the moment of impact. And so the Antarctic silence endures, broken only by the faint memory of a Twin Otter that lifted into cloud and never returned. July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra sent desperate position reports near Howland Island. Then silence. Despite the most extensive search of its time, the Pacific absorbed every trace. Earhart was already a global icon when she embarked on her fateful flight. The first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, She had captured the imagination of the world through her daring achievements and calm determination. By 1937, she set her sights on an even greater challenge: a circumnavigation of the globe along the equator, a route longer and more perilous than any attempted before. Her aircraft was a twin-engine Lockheed Model 10 Electra, specially modified for long-distance flight. Extra fuel tanks lined the fuselage, giving her the range needed to cross vast oceans. With her was navigator Fred Noonan, a seasoned specialist in celestial navigation. Together, they departed Miami in June 1937, flying eastward through South America, Africa, and Asia. Each leg of the journey brought them closer to their ultimate test, the Pacific. By July, the flight had reached Lae, New Guinea. From there, Earhart and Noonan planned a 2,500-mile leg to tiny Howland Island, a speck of land scarcely 2 miles long, lying midway between Australia and Hawaii. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited offshore, tasked with guiding them in via radio. The Electra departed Lae at dawn on July 2nd. Weather reports indicated scattered clouds and crosswinds, but nothing unusual. For much of the day, Earhart's transmissions reported steady progress. At 7:42 a.m. local time, her voice carried urgency. "We must be on you but cannot see you. Fuel is running low." Moments later, "We are on the line 157-337, then silence. The Itasca crew strained to make contact, broadcasting repeated signals. Noonan's navigation relied on visual landmarks and celestial fixes, but over the endless Pacific there were none. Without reliable two-way communication, the search became desperate guesswork. The US government launched the largest search operation in aviation history up to that time. More than 60 ships and aircraft scoured 250,000 square miles of ocean. The battleship Colorado, aircraft carrier Lexington, and multiple destroyers joined the effort. For weeks, till they combed the seas around Howland, Baker, and the Phoenix Islands. No wreckage was ever found. Theories multiplied. The most accepted is that the Electra, low on fuel, ditched into the Pacific near Howland and sank quickly. The ocean, over 17,000 feet deep in places, could easily have swallowed the aircraft intact, leaving no floating debris. Other theories suggest Earhart and Noonan may have reached nearby Nikumaroro, part of the Phoenix Islands. In the 1940s, human bones, shoe fragments, and aircraft aluminum were discovered there, sparking debate. Modern expeditions have uncovered artifacts consistent with 1930s technology, though none conclusively linked to Earhart. Still others point to radio signals reported in the days after the disappearance. Amateur operators claim to hear faint distress calls across the Pacific, describing voices pleading for help. Some accounts were dismissed as hoaxes, others as atmospheric interference. Yet the possibility lingers that Earhart and Noonan survived for a time, stranded on land or afloat, before the signals ceased. The mystery has outlived the searchers themselves. Earhart was declared lost at sea in 1939, but her legend grew. Books, documentaries, and expeditions continue to revisit the question: where did she fall, and what happened in those final hours? What endures most of all is the silence. A skilled pilot and navigator, flying a well-prepared aircraft, vanished within earshot of help. The Pacific remains vast, its depths concealing what decades of search have yet to reveal. To this day, Amelia Earhart's final flight stands as one of aviation's greatest enigmas, a journey intended to complete a circle around the world, broken instead by an ocean that gave back nothing. In 1973, Swissair Flight 404 crashed in the Alps after a navigation malfunction. Searchers found debris scattered wide, but investigators never resolved why instruments had failed so fatally in otherwise clear conditions. Swissair Flight 404 was a regular passenger service from Zurich to Rome, operated on October 10, 1973, using a McDonnell Douglas DC-9. On board were 43 people, passengers and crew who expected a short, uneventful journey over the Alps. The DC-9 was one of the most modern jetliners of its day, equipped with redundancy in its systems and a reputation for reliability. The flight took off from Zurich in the morning, climbing steadily into clear skies. Reports from air traffic control confirmed that weather was favourable, visibility excellent, winds moderate, no storms along the route. Yet within minutes of departure, the routine broke. At cruising altitude, the crew received clearance to proceed south across the Alps, but witnesses on the ground later recalled hearing engines roaring unnaturally low, echoing through valleys where no aircraft should have been. Moments later, the DC-9 struck high terrain near Wuenlingen in northern Switzerland, exploding on impact. All 43 on board were killed instantly. When search teams reached the crash site, they found wreckage strewn across forested hillsides. The pattern of debris indicated controlled flight into terrain rather than mid-air breakup. The engines showed evidence of power at impact, meaning the aircraft had been functioning until the final moments. Investigators quickly focused on navigation. The Alps have long posed challenges for aviation. Routes thread between mountains, and even small errors in heading or altitude can prove fatal. But the DC-9 was equipped with dual navigation systems designed to prevent such mistakes. For reasons still unclear, those systems appear to have misled the crew. The official accident reports suggested that the aircraft's inertial navigation system and radio beacons provided conflicting data. Investigators found no evidence of sabotage or weather interference, but they noted anomalies in how the systems had been tuned. Whether the crew misinterpreted readings or the instruments malfunctioned outright remained unresolved. Compounding the mystery, recordings from the air traffic control captured no distress call. The pilots gave no indication of confusion, no request for assistance. One moment the DC-9 was expected on course to Rome, the next it had flown straight into a ridgeline. In the aftermath, theories multiplied. Some argued that pilot error, perhaps a misset frequency on navigation radios, was to blame. Others pointed to possible electromagnetic interference in the Alps, where terrain can distort signals. A few suggested a hidden fault in the DC-9 systems, one that left no trace in wreckage. Families of those lost pressed for clarity, but the final report listed only controlled flight into terrain under unclear navigational circumstances. In other words, the crew flew into a mountain, but why they did so could not be fully explained. The crash had a lasting impact. Swissair and other European carriers introduced stricter procedures for cross-checking navigation inputs and expanded training on terrain awareness. Yet the central question, why experienced pilots trusted instruments that led them astray, was never answered with certainty. Today, the site of Flight 404 is marked by a small memorial in the Swiss hills. Locals still recall the thunder of engines and the sudden silence that followed. Aviation historians note it as one of the more unsettling accidents of the 1970s. A modern jet, clear skies, no distress call, and instruments that seem to betray their operators. And so Flight 404 endures not only as a tragic crash, but as a symbol of aviation's thin margin for error, where even the clearest skies can conceal a mystery that no investigation can quite resolve. A chartered DC-6 vanished on a nighttime route across the Atlantic in 1961. Radio checks seemed routine. By dawn, searchers found no oil slick, no life rafts, only drifting silence where an airliner had been. The Douglas DC-6 was a dependable four-engine propeller aircraft, built to bridge oceans in the post-war years. By the 1960s, it had become a trusted workhorse of both passenger and cargo operations, known for its endurance and relative comfort on long flights. The aircraft that disappeared in 1961 was on a charter service between Lisbon and New York, with a scheduled refueling stop in the Azores. On board were passengers bound for America and a crew accustomed to the Atlantic route. Takeoff from Lisbon was uneventful. At 10 p.m, controllers logged the DC-6 climbing to cruising altitude under calm skies. Position reports came in on schedule, each delivered with routine precision. The Atlantic corridor between Portugal and the Azores was busy enough to offer reassurance. Other aircraft shared the airwaves, each relaying their progress westward. The DC-6's voice blended in among them, confident, steady, and ordinary. Around midnight, the aircraft was expected to check in near Santa Maria, the Azores island with an important transatlantic airfield. But that transmission never came. Controllers repeated calls. Other aircraft on the same frequency attempted contact. The ocean airwaves carried no response. By dawn, alarm had spread. The US Coast Guard, Portuguese Navy, and civilian airliners were mobilized to search. The Atlantic around the Azores was combed by ships and long-range patrol planes. Expectations were high that at least something would be found. A floating cushion, a slick of oil, fragments of fuselage. These were common markers of ocean crashes. Yet day after day, the sea remained empty. Investigators considered fuel exhaustion, but calculations showed adequate reserves for the segment. Mechanical failure was possible, yet engines typically gave warning signs long before complete failure. Even a ditching at sea should have left debris. Survivors might have clung to rafts or wreckage. None were ever sighted. The absence of oil slicks was particularly troubling. Large aircraft carried thousands of tons of fuel. In past accidents, even when fuselages sank quickly, rainbow sheens on the water betrayed their location. In this case, the Atlantic gave no such clue. Some pointed to weather, though reports from other aircraft that night described only scattered clouds and mild turbulence. Radar coverage of the mid-Atlantic in 1961 was limited, offering little to reconstruct the flight path. Without distress calls or wreckage, the final moments could not be charted. Speculation filled the void. A catastrophic in-flight explosion was one theory, perhaps from an undetected fuel leak or electrical fire. Such an event might have scattered debris so widely that none was concentrated enough to be spotted. Others suggested structural failure, though the DC-6's record offered little precedent. Among locals in the Azores, the disappearance blended with older seafaring tales of ships and planes vanishing without trace. Fishermen spoke of sudden squalls and hidden currents, while aviation historians pointed to the region's association with the so-called Bermuda Triangle pattern of unexplained vanishings, though geographically distinct. For the families of those aboard, the lack of closure was devastating. Without debris or bodies, funerals were held without remains. The Atlantic became both grave and mystery, swallowing evidence too quickly to return. Today, the disappearance of the 1961 DC-6 remains largely forgotten. A Bristol freighter left France bound for England with cargo and crew. Mid-channel, radio reports ended abruptly. The sea offered nothing back despite heavy searching across one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. The Bristol Type 170 freighter was a utilitarian workhorse of post-war Europe. With its distinctive nose-loading doors and twin-piston engines, it carried vehicles, goods, and passengers across short routes where speed mattered less than efficiency. By the 1950s and early 1960s, the freighter was a familiar sight over the English Channel, moving cargo between the continent and Britain in all weather. On the day of its disappearance, the aircraft departed from Le Touquet on the northern French coast, bound for Lydd in England. The route was short, less than 100 miles, and flown dozens of times a day by passenger liners and freighters alike. Weather reports indicated overcast skies but calm winds. Visibility was considered sufficient for visual navigation, and the crew, experienced with channel crossings, expected no difficulties. The Bristol freighter climbed into the grey sky and levelled at cruising altitude. Radio transmissions from the crew were routine, acknowledging departure and confirming their position over mid-channel. Then, without warning, the voice cut off. Attempts to raise the aircraft failed. By the time controllers realised the seriousness, the freighter was overdue at Lydd. Search and rescue operations began immediately. The Channel, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, was crowded with vessels that could have spotted signs of distress. Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy assets joined the hunt, sweeping the sea surface for wreckage. Merchant ships reported scanning the waters throughout the day. Nothing was found. Normally, a crash at sea yields evidence quickly. Aircraft of the freighter's size carried thousands of litres of fuel, which, if spilled, should have left an oil slick. Lightweight debris, wooden crates, cargo straps, seat cushions would be expected to float. Yet the Channel remained stubbornly empty, as though the aircraft had slipped beneath the waves intact. Investigators considered possible causes. A sudden engine failure could have forced the aircraft down, but the freighter was capable of flying on one engine long enough to reach land. Structural failure was another theory, though the type was known for its sturdy build. Weather did not appear severe enough to explain a catastrophic event. Some speculated about mid-air collision. The Channel was crowded with air traffic, and in the days before radar coverage was comprehensive, navigation errors were not unknown. Yet no other aircraft reported incident that day. For families of the crew, the absence of wreckage meant no answers and no closure. Memorials were held without remains, names inscribed on plaques without graves. The loss also troubled investigators for its geography. The Channel is narrow, shallow in many areas, and thoroughly traversed by ships. Unlike the vast expanses of the Pacific or Atlantic, it is one of the least likely places for an aircraft to vanish completely. Yet the Bristol freighter did. In the years since, occasional claims of wreckage sightings have surfaced. Fishermen reported snagging nets on metal in suspected locations, though sonar scans revealed nothing conclusive. Some suggested the freighter sank intact, weighted by its cargo slipping quickly below the busy surface before ships could notice. Still, the official record ends with uncertainty. The accident report concluded only that the aircraft failed to arrive at destination under unknown circumstances. Today, the disappearance is remembered as a reminder that even in well-mapped and heavily travelled skies, the sea can keep its secrets. The channel, crowded and narrow though it is, swallowed the freighter whole, leaving only unanswered calls and the empty expanse of grey water where it was last heard. A US Navy Super Constellation disappeared off Bermuda in October 1954. Its final call noted nothing unusual. Search efforts spanned hundreds of miles. Neither wreckage nor survivors were found, despite the weather being calm. The Lockheed Super Constellation was among the most advanced long-range aircraft of its day. Sleek and powerful with 4 Wright R3350 engines, it served both civilian airlines and the US military. Flight 441 was assigned to Naval Air Transport Squadron 3, tasked with ferrying personnel and cargo across the Atlantic to support American bases. On October 30th, 1954, the aircraft departed Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland, bound for Lajes Field in the Azores, with 42 sailors and crew aboard. The route was well established, a direct line across the Atlantic with Bermuda serving as a midpoint. Weather forecasts predicted calm seas and steady skies, ideal conditions for a long-distance flight. Through the night, radio transmissions from Flight 441 were steady and uneventful. At 11 p.m, the crew checked in with a routine position report, confirming altitude and course. Their tone carried no urgency, no sign of mechanical trouble or weather interference. It was the last message ever received. Minutes later, silence. When the aircraft failed to report at its next waypoint, controllers attempted repeated calls on multiple frequencies. No answer came. Other aircraft flying the corridor also tried to raise the Super Constellation, but the airwaves remained empty. The US Navy immediately launched a massive search. Over the next week, aircraft and ships combed more than 300,000 square miles of ocean. Search grids extended far beyond Bermuda, reaching east toward the Azores and west toward the US mainland. Despite calm seas and good visibility, no oil slick, debris or life raft was located. The Super Constellation had vanished as completely as if the ocean had erased it. Investigators examined every possible explanation. A catastrophic in-flight failure, such as structural breakup or engine fire, was one scenario. Yet such an event would likely have left wreckage floating on the sea. The Super Constellation carried enough fuel to create a visible slick in the event of impact, but none was found. Another theory was rapid decompression or electrical failure, events that could disable the crew's ability to send a distress call. Still, even in such cases, some debris should have surfaced. The absence of evidence remained the most puzzling element. The timing of the loss added to speculation. The region east of Bermuda had already developed a reputation for unexplained disappearances, from Flight 19 in 1945 to numerous smaller aircraft and ships. Flight 441 fit the same pattern: calm conditions, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and no trace. Officially, the Navy concluded that the aircraft was lost at sea under unknown circumstances. Families were informed of the loss, but no remains were ever recovered. Memorial services were held without bodies, with names etched on plaques honouring those who never returned. In the decades since, the mystery of Flight 441 has remained unresolved. Some historians suggest the aircraft may have encountered severe turbulence at altitude, plunging into the sea before the crew could react. Others argue that mechanical failure compounded by the weight of cargo could have led to a sudden stall. Yet none of these theories explain the total lack of wreckage. Today, the disappearance is remembered as one of the major military aviation mysteries of the mid-20th century. The Super Constellation, designed for long-distance endurance and reliability, simply failed to reach its destination. The calm Atlantic gave no answers, only silence. And in that silence, the fate of Flight 441 remained suspended, another story woven into the long list of vanishings that haunt the skies near Bermuda. Japan Airlines' lost DC-9 was believed to have suffered an in-flight breakup, yet sonar and divers never located the fuselage. The absence of debris keeps the official record marked simply, cause unknown. Japan Airlines Flight 967 was a scheduled domestic flight in November 1969, operating a DC-9 twin-jet designed for short to medium routes. The DC-9 was modern at the time, with pressurized cabins and advanced avionics, and had already become a mainstay in fleets worldwide. Its safety record was solid. The loss of Flight 967 would challenge those assumptions. On the morning of November 8th, Flight 967 departed Tokyo bound for Fukuoka, carrying passengers and crew familiar with the routine coastal run. The weather was reported clear, with scattered clouds and little turbulence, ideal conditions for a jetliner. At 9:27 a.m, the aircraft made a routine position report while cruising at altitude. The crew's tone was calm, their message entirely ordinary. It was the last anyone heard. Minutes later, radar controllers noted the aircraft's return blip fade abruptly from screens. There was no distress call, no indication of emergency. Search operations began immediately. The presumed crash zone lay over the Pacific, along a corridor busy with fishing vessels and commercial traffic. Ships and aircraft were dispatched to scour the waters. For days, searchers covered hundreds of miles of ocean, but results were meagre. A few fragments of cabin upholstery and a handful of life jackets floated to the surface. The main fuselage, engines, and majority of the wreckage were never found. Investigators concluded that the DC-9 had likely suffered a catastrophic mid-air breakup. The wide scatter of light debris supported this theory, suggesting that the aircraft disintegrated before hitting the sea. But the absence of heavy wreckage, wings, engines, fuselage sections, remained deeply puzzling. Such components, even if sunk, should have been detectable by sonar. Teams of divers and naval vessels conducted underwater sweeps, deploying sonar across suspected impact zones. Yet the Pacific floor revealed no trace. Currents may have carried wreckage farther than expected, but no definitive site was located. For families waiting on the shore, the silence from the search became unbearable. The Civil Aviation Bureau of Japan left the final report inconclusive. "Cause unknown" was the phrase etched into the official record, a stark acknowledgement of the limits of available evidence. Without flight data recorders, then not yet mandatory on all aircraft, the final minutes of Flight 967 were lost to history. Speculation filled the vacuum. Some suggested an onboard explosion, possibly from fuel system failure or undetected corrosion in the fuselage. Others pointed to the possibility of a sudden decompression event at altitude. But none of these theories could explain the near-total absence of wreckage. Over the decades, alternative theories emerged. A few researchers proposed that the aircraft may have diverted from its expected course, crashing in deeper waters beyond the search zone. Others suggested that recovery efforts were hampered by underestimating ocean currents, which in the Western Pacific can disperse debris across hundreds of miles within days. Yet the human dimension was the most enduring. Families of passengers received no remains, only official condolences. Memorials were erected in absence of bodies. The sea, for them, was both grave and mystery. Today, aviation historians remember Flight 967 as one of Japan Airlines' most enduring enigmas. It was a modern jet, flying in clear skies, carrying out routine transmissions, and then vanishing almost without a trace. The Pacific held its secret tightly. No fuselage, no engines, no conclusive answers, only a handful of fragments and the chilling simplicity of a final report that reads, "Cause unknown." A BOAC Stratocruiser sent a position report while flying from New York to London. Minutes later, its voice cut off. Wreckage spotted in the Atlantic proved inconclusive, and the fate of its 48 passengers remains unresolved. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was one of the most luxurious airliners of its era. Built in the late 1940s from the design lineage of the B-29 bomber, it offered passengers unheard of amenities, spacious seating, a lower deck lounge, and long-range capability for transatlantic crossings. British Overseas Airways Corporation (BOAC) operated several on the busy route between London and New York, bridging continents in just over 12 hours. On January 10, 1951, one such Stratocruiser named RMA Belfast departed New York's Idlewild Airport bound for London. On board were 31 passengers and 17 crew, many of them businessmen and travellers returning to post-war Britain. The weather forecast called for strong Atlantic headwinds, but otherwise clear skies. The Stratocruiser, with its 4 powerful radial engines, was built for such endurance. For most of the night, the flight was uneventful. Position reports transmitted by radio confirmed the aircraft's progress as it crossed the North Atlantic. Shortly before dawn, as the Stratocruiser neared Ireland, it transmitted another routine update. altitude, location, and estimated arrival time. The crew's tone was calm, their voices steady. Minutes later, silence. Controllers in Shannon and London repeated calls. No response came. Other aircraft in the area attempted to raise the Stratocruiser on emergency frequencies, but none heard a word. The aircraft had disappeared into the cold Atlantic night. Within hours, search and rescue operations were underway. The Royal Air Force and Royal Navy dispatched planes and ships to scour the seas west of Ireland. Merchant vessels diverted course to join the hunt. The Atlantic was busy with traffic, and hopes were high that survivors might be found. What they discovered instead was fragmentary. Searchers recovered seat cushions, bits of fuselage, and a scattering of personal effects floating on the waves. Oil slicks stretched across the surface, marking a likely crash site. Yet the main fuselage and engines, heavy components that might have offered clues, were never located. Without them, investigators could not reconstruct the sequence of events. Speculation began immediately. Some suggested sudden mechanical failure, such as structural breakup in turbulence or failure of one of the massive radial engines. The Stratocruiser's engines, powerful but temperamental, were known for overheating and consuming oil at high rates. A fire or catastrophic failure might have brought the aircraft down before a distress call could be made. Others proposed rapid decompression. If the pressurized cabin had failed at altitude, chaos might have overwhelmed the crew before they could signal. But such scenarios usually left more debris, and the floating fragments offered no clear pattern. The possibility of crew error was also examined, but the last transmission gave no hint of confusion or trouble. Weather reports noted no storms or icing at the time of the disappearance. The aircraft had been on course in clear conditions until it was gone. For the families of the 48 aboard, the lack of answers deepened the loss. With only fragments recovered, there were no remains to bury, no closure beyond official telegrams that declared their loved ones lost at sea. The investigation ultimately closed with the Bertus Stark phrase common to unresolved accidents of the era: cause unknown. The absence of black box recorders, mandatory only decades later, meant no cockpit voices or flight data could be studied. The Atlantic kept its secret. Today, the disappearance of the RMA Belfast is remembered as one of the unsolved tragedies of early commercial aviation. It was a modern airliner, flown by an experienced crew, on a well-travelled route in good weather. And yet, somewhere west of Ireland, it fell shindant, leaving behind nothing but fragments and a void in the record. The sea gave only glimpses, never the whole, and in that silence, the fate of Flight 1951 remains unresolved. A patrol PBY Catalina disappeared on weather reconnaissance near Newfoundland in 1944. Its final signal suggested unexpected icing. The wreck was never found, just a ghost in maritime weather logs. The consolidated PBY Catalina was one of the most versatile aircraft of World War II. Designed as a long-range flying boat, it patrolled oceans for submarines, ferried cargo, and scouted weather systems vital to wartime planning. Crews nicknamed it the Cat, dependable machine capable of landing on both water and runways, giving it unmatched flexibility in maritime operations. In February 1944, one Catalina was tasked with a weather reconnaissance flight out of Newfoundland. These missions, though unheralded, were critical to the war effort. Accurate forecasts shaped naval convoys, transatlantic supply runs, and bombing campaigns over Europe. To obtain them, crews ventured into harsh skies where conditions could shift without warning. The Catalina lifted off in the grey dawn, engines droning steadily as it climbed into the cloud. The crew of 8 reported routine progress through their first hour of flight. Then at 10:12 a.m, radio operators received a short clipped message: severe icing, adjusting altitude. It was the last transmission. Icing was among the greatest hazards of the era. Supercooled water droplets clung to wings and control surfaces, adding weight and disrupting airflow. In minutes, lift could vanish. Engines too were vulnerable. Carburetor icing could rob them of power, leaving the aircraft struggling in freezing skies. Even the sturdy Catalina, designed for endurance, was not immune. When the flight failed to return, search efforts began quickly. US and Canadian aircraft swept the North Atlantic approaches, while naval vessels scanned the waters below. Weather hampered visibility, but patrols pressed on, hoping for oil slicks or floating wreckage. None appeared. Days stretched into weeks. No debris was sighted, no survivors rescued. The Catalina and its crew seemed to have dissolved into the very weather they sought to measure. Maritime logs noted the loss. recording only the cryptic final message about icing. Investigators examined possible scenarios. The most likely was loss of lift due to rapid ice accumulation, sending the aircraft into the sea. If the Catalina had stalled at low altitude, impact might have broken the fuselage quickly, allowing it to sink before debris could scatter. In the frigid North Atlantic, survival time for the crew would have been measured in minutes. Yet the total absence of evidence unsettled even hardened wartime officials. Normally, wooden and metal components of Catalinas floated after impact. Seat cushions, life rafts and wing sections were known to remain buoyant for days. None were recovered. Some speculated that the aircraft may have struck drifting pack ice, breaking apart and vanishing beneath floes before searchers arrived. Others suggested it descended into waters so rough that fragments were dispersed too widely to be noticed. For families of the lost crew, the silence was heavy. With no bodies recovered, memorial services were conducted in absence, names etched into stone without graves. In Newfoundland and New England, where such patrols were common, the loss was a reminder of the daily risks faced by airmen whose missions rarely made headlines. Over the years, the Catalina's fate has occasionally resurfaced in naval histories and aviation studies. Each retelling points back to the same details: the clipped final transmission, the icing report, and the blank sea that followed. Without wreckage, the case remained open-ended, a ghost line in records of wartime weather flights. Today, the North Atlantic skies above Newfoundland are monitored by satellites, radars, and computer models. But in 1944, a crew of 8 men lifted into cloud armed only with their instruments and skill. Their last word was icing, after that only silence. The Catalina remains lost, buried not in earth but in cloud and sea, a patrol erased from sight, preserved only in the faded ink of a logbook. A US Army training biplane flew into cloud near Dayton, Ohio. Witnesses heard the drone overhead, then silence. No wreckage was located until decades later, unearthed in a farmer's field long forgotten by time. In the closing months of World War I, aviation in the United States was still in its infancy. Training bases dotted the Midwest, where flat land and wide skies provided ideal conditions for novice pilots. Near Dayton, Ohio, home to the Wright brothers and their legacy, young Army aviators practiced takeoffs, landings, and navigation in fragile biplanes built of wood, wire, coamie, and a canvas. On a cool spring morning in 1918, one such aircraft departed a training field with a student pilot and instructor on board. The mission was routine, a short navigation exercise, staying within sight of landmarks and returning within the hour. The aircraft climbed steadily, its Liberty engine coughing before settling into a steady rhythm. Witnesses on the ground recalled seeing the biplane fly into a low bank of cloud. In those days, flying into cloud was perilous. Early cockpits lacked gyroscopic instruments, leaving pilots reliant on sight alone. Once inside, horizon and sky became indistinguishable. Spatial disorientation could set in within seconds, turning steady flight into a fatal spiral. Locals heard the drone of the engine for several minutes. Then suddenly, silence. Farmers searched fields and woodlots for signs of impact, but nothing was found. The Army dispatched ground patrols, combing the countryside on horseback and on foot. Despite days of searching, no wreckage surfaced. For families of the 2 airmen, the absence of answers was unbearable. Telegrams listed them as missing, a word that carried a weight of uncertainty. With the war consuming attention overseas, the disappearance became a small footnote, overshadowed by greater tragedies. Decades passed. Fields were ploughed, crops planted, and the landscape slowly changed. By the 1940s, memories of the lost biplane had faded into local lore, a tale told by older residents who still recalled the sound of its engine disappearing into the cloud. Then in the late 1950s, a farmer ploughing a remote section of land struck metal beneath the soil. Digging revealed twisted fragments of wood and rusted engine parts. Slowly the truth resurfaced. The biplane had gone down in an isolated corner of the field, burying itself under soil and vegetation. Its presence had been hidden for decades, erased by time until chance brought it back. Investigators confirmed the identity of the wreck through serial numbers etched on surviving components. The remains of the crew were long gone, claimed by Earth and weather. Yet the discovery closed a chapter left open for 40 years. For the families, some now 2 generations removed, the knowledge offered belated closure, though it came far too late for those who had waited in 1918. Aviation historians note that such losses were not uncommon in the early days of flight. Without modern navigation aids, even a small patch of weather could disorient pilots fatally. Biplanes lack the power to climb above storms or the instrumentation to navigate blindly. Many training flights ended in silence, their wrecks discovered only years later. Yet the story of the Dayton biplane carries a resonance beyond technical explanation. It is a reminder of the fragility of those early aviators who pushed into skies still poorly understood. Their sacrifice, often unrecorded in detail, formed the foundation on which later aviation safety was built. Today, the field where the wreck was found bears no marker, only quiet farmland. The story survives in archives and local memory, a tale of two airmen swallowed by cloud and hidden by soil for decades. And so the ill-fated flight of 1918 remains less a tale of resolution than one of time's erasure, a plane that vanished into cloud, its silence stretching across generations, until the Earth itself gave back its secret. In 1990, a commuter flight in Venezuela lifted into evening cloud. Ground radar recorded a normal climb. Then the blip simply faded. Villagers near the mountain spoke of distant thunder. The wreck was never found. The aircraft was a small commuter turboprop, serving one of the many regional routes that connected remote towns in Venezuela to larger cities. Such flights were vital to communities scattered across valleys and mountain ridges, where roads were poor and rivers impassable during rainy seasons. On the evening of January 22, 1990, Flight 708 departed from Mérida, a city tucked high in the Andes, bound for Caracas. The flight carried a mix of business travelers and families returning home. Weather at departure was unsettled. Low clouds hung along the slopes, and late afternoon storms brewed across the valleys. Still, the aircraft was cleared to fly. Pilots accustomed to the region knew that brief turbulence and shifting cloud layers were normal hazards of the Andes. Climbing out from the airport, the flight appeared stable on radar. Controllers logged routine altitude updates, the aircraft on track for its airway north, then abruptly the signal faded. No distress call preceded the disappearance. Controllers attempted to raise the aircraft repeatedly. Other pilots on the same frequency heard only static. Search efforts began within hours. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft traced the expected route, scouring valleys and ridgelines. The Andes, however, posed immense challenges. Clouds closed around peaks, limiting visibility to only a few hundred feet. Dense forests concealed slopes from the air. Searchers reported hearing nothing. No beacon, no emergency signal, only silence. In nearby villages, people recalled hearing a distant rumble around the time of the disappearance. Some described it as thunder rolling down the valleys. Others insisted it was different, a sudden, heavy sound followed by quiet. Whether they heard weather or the impact of an aircraft could not be determined. Days stretched into weeks. Teams trekked into remote mountainsides, guided by rumours of smoke or metallic flashes seen by locals. Each lead dissolved into dead ends. The jungle was too thick, the terrain too vast. Eventually, the official search was called off. Families were left with only absence. Investigators reviewed available data. The last radar return suggested the aircraft was climbing normally, with no sign of deviation or distress. Weather was poor but not extreme. The pilots were experienced, their maintenance logs up to date. With no wreckage to analyse, the final report closed with the most frustrating of conclusions. Cause unknown. Speculation endured. Some suggested controlled flight into terrain, a common hazard in mountainous regions when cloud obscures ridgelines. Others argued that severe downdrafts or microbursts, powerful vertical currents common in the Andes, could have forced the aircraft downward before the crew could respond. More unconventional voices pointed to electromagnetic disturbances, recalling that Venezuela's Andes have long been associated with reports of compasses faltering and instruments behaving strangely. For families, theories mattered little. Without wreckage, no bodies could be returned, no graves could be marked. The mountains had taken their loved ones and given back nothing. Each anniversary revived the same unanswered questions. Where had the aircraft gone, and why had it left no trace? Even decades later, no confirmed wreckage of Flight 708 has been recovered. Satellite imagery and modern surveys occasionally revisit the area, but thick canopy and constant landslides make discovery unlikely. Like other disappearances in aviation history, the case has joined the long list of flights erased mid-air, leaving silence as the only testimony. The Andes rise steep and unforgiving, their ridges wrapped in cloud and storm. In 1990, a commuter aircraft lifted into their sky and vanished. All that remains is a radar blip that faded without explanation, the memory of thunder rolling across distant valleys, and the enduring mystery of a flight that never arrived. In 1978, an Australian Cessna flown by Frederick Valentich reported a shiny object following him. Radar tracked both targets, then lost them. The pilot's voice cut to mid-sentence. His aircraft has never been found. Frederick Valentich was 20 years old, a licensed pilot with over 150 flying hours. He was young but eager, with ambitions of eventually becoming a commercial aviator. On October the 21st, 1978, he rented a Cessna 182L, a single-engine light aircraft from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne. His planned route was straightforward, a 125-mile trip across Bass Strait to King Island. It was a journey expected to take just over an hour. Conditions that evening were calm, visibility was good, with scattered cloud at higher altitudes and light winds across the strait. Valentich departed at 6:19 p.m, climbing to 4,500 feet. For the first 40 minutes, transmissions with Melbourne Flight Service were routine. Then at 7:06 p.m, his voice took on a different tone. Valentich reported seeing an unidentified aircraft playing above him, describing it as long, shiny and metallic. He noted 4 bright lights and said the object passed overhead at high speed. Air traffic controllers, surprised, asked him to clarify. He responded that the craft was orbiting and that he could not identify its type. As minutes passed, his transmissions grew more urgent. He described the mysterious object as moving in ways unlike conventional aircraft, hovering, then darting away at angles. He reported that his engine was rough idling and that his instruments were behaving strangely. At 7:12 p.m, Valentich made his final chilling statement. "It's not an aircraft." After that, an open carrier wave transmitted for 17 seconds, described as containing metallic scraping sounds, then silence. Radar at Melbourne detected both Valentich's Cessna and another unidentified returner in the area at the time. Both blips vanished almost simultaneously. Search and rescue operations began immediately, scouring 1,000 square miles of sea. Aircraft and ships combed the Bass Strait for days. No wreckage, no oil slick, and no trace of Valentich or his Cessna were ever found. The official investigation concluded only that the aircraft was missing, presumed lost at sea. No evidence suggested mechanical failure, though disorientation at twilight over water was considered a possibility. Investigators noted Valentich was relatively inexperienced in night navigation and might have misinterpreted natural phenomena. Theories multiplied. Some argued he had mistaken the planet Venus, or reflections from his own aircraft for another craft. Others proposed he entered a graveyard spiral, an unrecognized descent common in cases of spatial disorientation. Yet neither fully explained the radar contact with a second object, nor the extended transmission captured before silence. More sensational interpretations suggested an encounter with an unidentified flying object. Valentich's recorded statements became central to UFO literature, cited as one of the strongest aviation cases involving unexplained aerial phenomena. Skeptics countered that stress, fatigue, or misperception shaped his descriptions. For Valentich's family, the disappearance was more personal than speculative. His father publicly expressed belief that Frederick had been taken, while others in the aviation community stressed the likelihood of disorientation and accidental descent into the sea. Without wreckage, no conclusion could be proven. Decades later, occasional reports of debris washing ashore in southern Australia were tested, but none were conclusively linked to the missing Cessna. The Bass Strait, deep and turbulent, has yielded nothing. Today, the Valentich case remains one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. A young pilot, calm and professional until his final moments, reported something extraordinary in the sky. Then, as radar confirmed 2 returns, both vanished. The last sound was a voice cut off mid-sentence, leaving the world to wonder, did the sea take him, or did the sky? From the Caribbean to the Pacific, from the Andes to Antarctica, stories repeat. Engines hum, radios chatter, then stop. Each disappearance leaves only the sound of static and the wide, waiting silence of the sky. Across aviation history, the theme is hauntingly consistent. Pilots lift confidently into clear weather or storm-shadowed cloud, transmitting routine calls to ground stations. Passengers sit in their seats, unaware that their journey will never arrive at its destination. Somewhere between departure and arrival, silence falls, and in that silence the sky takes what it chooses. The Florida Straits, where a DC-3 sent its final calm message before vanishing without debris. The South Atlantic, where Air France 447 slipped from radar into icy seas. The wide Pacific, which holds the memory of Flight 739, MH370, and Amelia Earhart's Electra, all swallowed by an ocean too deep for answers. The Andes, where Stardust, Star Tiger, and Flight 571 vanished into white silence. And Antarctica, where ice conceals the wreckage of a twin otter, entombed within glaciers that shift and bury evidence year by year. In each case, investigators gather fragments, radar echoes, stray cushions, garbled final words. They build timelines, consult weather logs, measure currents. Yet at the end of every search, the most common phrase appears: cause unknown. The official language of mystery, repeated so often it becomes almost ritual. Technology has improved. Modern jets carry flight data recorders, satellites track their movements, and international systems monitor skies across the globe. But even in this age of constant surveillance, aircraft still slip beyond reach. MH370 proved that in 2014, when despite satellites and search fleets, a Boeing 777 with 239 people disappeared almost as cleanly as the wooden biplanes of 1918. The silence of the sky endures, untouched by progress. For families, the silence is not abstract. It is the absence of voices, the weight of questions unanswered. Without wreckage, there are no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Instead, memorials rise in empty fields or along coastlines, marked by names without remains. The sky becomes both tomb and mystery. Aviation historians point to the sheer scale of Earth's uncharted spaces. Vast oceans conceal wreckage thousands of meters deep. Mountain glaciers shift and entomb, hiding evidence for generations. Remote forests stretch for hundreds of miles without a single road. Against such backdrops, even modern machines vanish into invisibility. And so the cycle continues. Engines hum, radios report, then static. A fragment may return decades later, a wing revealed by melting ice, an oil slick drifting to shore, or bones unearthed in a farmer's field. But often there is nothing. What lingers instead is the human imprint. Whispered last transmissions, entries in maritime weather logs, the faint radar blip that fades into noise. These traces remind us of how fragile flight can be, how narrow the margin is between routine and catastrophe. The enduring silence of the skies is not just absence, but a presence of its own. It is the waiting quiet of oceans, the stillness of mountains, the heavy air before storm. In that silence live the stories of pilots and passengers who never returned, each one an unfinished line written into the ledger of aviation. And so, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, the Andes to Antarctica, the silence remains. A reminder that even in an age of satellites and constant signals, there are places where voices vanish, leaving only the wide, unbroken hush of the sky.